Did you know that the man who made space travel possible died before a single human being ever left the atmosphere? Did you know that while he was alive, most of the world laughed at him, called him a fool, a dreamer, a dangerous crank who read too many science fiction novels and not enough reality? What if I told you that the rockets that carried human beings to the moon, the missiles that changed the shape of warfare forever, the satellites that right now, at this very moment, are orbiting silently above your head, all of them trace their lineage back to one man, working alone in a frost-hardened field in Massachusetts with almost no money, almost no support, and an idea so far ahead of its time that the world simply did not have the vocabulary to understand it. Can you imagine what it feels like to carry a vision so enormous inside you that it becomes a kind of madness, a beautiful, consuming, terrifying madness, and to know somewhere deep in the marrow of your bones that you are right, even when everyone around you insists that you are wrong? This is the story of Robert Hutchings Goddard, and it begins not with fire, not with metal, not with the thunder of an engine tearing itself free from the earth. It begins with the boy, a quiet, serious, uncommonly thoughtful boy, standing in the backyard of his family's home in Worcester, Massachusetts, on a cold autumn afternoon in 1899, looking up at the sky the way most children look at something they are trying to memorize, as though the sky itself were a page in a book that only he had been given to read. Close your eyes for a moment and try to feel it. The year is 1899. The 20th century has not yet arrived. The Wright brothers have not yet flown. The word astronaut does not exist. The idea that a human being might one day leave this planet, might drift weightless above the clouds, might look back at the Earth from the dark silence of space, that idea lives only in the pages of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, in the fevered imaginations of writers whom serious people regard with gentle amusement. The world is a world of horses and gas lamps and dirt roads and the creaking of wooden floorboards. The sky is still the final, absolute, unbreachable ceiling of human ambition. And in that world, on that afternoon, a 17-year-old boy climbs a cherry tree in his backyard in Worcester, Massachusetts, and something inside him shifts, quietly, permanently, the way a fault line shifts beneath the earth long before anyone feels the earthquake. He would remember that afternoon for the rest of his life. He would mark it on his calendar every single year. He called it Anniversary Day. The day he looked up through the branches of that cherry tree at the pale autumn sky and felt, for the first time, the full, impossible weight of a dream that had no name yet, a dream of going up, not just up into the air, up beyond the air, up into the dark and the cold and the infinite silence where no human being had ever gone. He climbed down from that tree a different person than the one who had climbed up. He didn't know it yet, but the rest of his life had just begun. To understand Robert Goddard, you have to understand Worcester. You have to understand what it meant to grow up in a small industrial city in New England at the turn of the 20th century, in a family that was comfortable but not wealthy, respectable but not prominent, proud but quietly struggling. Worcester was a city of factories and churches and hard winters and harder people. It was a city that valued practicality above almost everything else, a city that had very little patience for the extravagant, the theoretical, the dreamily impractical. It was, in almost every way, the least likely place on Earth to produce a man who would one day point at the stars and say with complete and unshakable conviction that he intended to reach them.
This missile represents a
Nahum Goddard, Robert's father, was a practical man, a businessman. He worked in the machine knife industry, not glamorous work, but solid, steady American work. He was a gentleman by most accounts, a man who believed in education, in quiet persistence, in the dignity of doing things carefully and doing them well. He loved his son in the particular way that New England fathers of that era loved their children, not with great shows of emotion, but with a steady, reliable presence, with a willingness to listen, with a kind of patient attention that is, in its own quiet way, a form of devotion. Robert would inherit his father's patience. He would need every molecule of it. Fanny Louise Hoyt, Robert's mother, was a different kind of person entirely. She was delicate in a way that the word barely captures. She suffered from tuberculosis, the great slow killer of that era, and her health was always uncertain, always precarious, casting a long shadow over the household that Robert grew up in. There was something about living inside that shadow, something about watching his mother struggle, watching her fight quietly and without complaint against a body that kept betraying her, that gave Robert Goddard a particular relationship with fragility, with limitation, with the idea that the physical world imposes constraints that the mind refuses to accept. His mother's illness was in a strange and terrible way one of the first engines of his ambition. If the body could be so easily defeated, then the mind had to compensate. The mind had to go further. The mind had to go somewhere the body could not follow. He was a sickly child himself. This is something the history books mention in passing, but it deserves more than a passing mention because it shaped him in ways that go far deeper than mere biography. Robert Goddard spent enormous stretches of his childhood in bed. Not months, years. He was frequently ill, frequently absent from school, frequently confined to the quiet world of his room and his thoughts, while other boys his age were out running and playing and building the social muscles that would carry them through adult life. He missed so much school that by the time he graduated from high school, he was years older than most of his classmates. He was 21 years old when he received his high school diploma. 21. In a different boy, in a boy with less internal fire, that kind of prolonged isolation and enforced stillness might have produced resignation. It might have produced bitterness. In Robert Goddard, it produced something else entirely. It produced a reader, a thinker, a dreamer of a very specific and very dangerous kind, the kind who dreams with precision.
Because here is what Robert Goddard did with all those long, quiet hours in bed. He read. He read voraciously, hungrily, with the desperate appetite of someone who has been locked in a room and has discovered that books are a door. He read science. He read mathematics. He read the works of Isaac Newton and tried to understand, at a level of genuine comprehension rather than mere memorization, what Newton was actually saying about the way the physical world worked. He read Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon and felt something ignite inside him that was not quite hope and not quite obsession, but something that lived in the territory between those two things. He read H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds and felt, this is the crucial thing, not the fear that most readers felt, not the thrill of adventure, but a kind of engineering curiosity. He did not ask himself as a reader what it would feel like to be visited by Martians. He asked himself as a nascent scientist and engineer how one might actually travel between worlds. What would it take? What were the forces involved? What were the constraints? What were the possibilities? This is the thing about Robert Goddard that sets him apart from the other dreamers of his era. There were plenty of people in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who dreamed about space travel. It was in the culture. Jules Verne had put it there. H.G. Wells had deepened it. The nascent science fiction genre was full of voyages to other planets and encounters with alien civilizations. But almost all of those dreamers stayed in the realm of dream. They imagined, they fantasized, they wrote stories. Robert Goddard did something different. Robert Goddard looked at the dream and then immediately, almost compulsively, began trying to figure out how to make it real. He was not a fantasist. He was an engineer who happened to be dreaming of the impossible, which is a very different creature and a far more dangerous one. By the time he climbed that cherry tree in 1899, He had already been wrestling for years with the physical principles that would govern his life's work. He understood, at least in the intuitive way of a brilliant teenager, that getting off the Earth was not primarily a problem of imagination. It was a problem of force,
Ignition
of
sequence
thrust,
start. Thrust is
of the
building.
relationship between
We have
mass
left
and
off,
velocity,
Reverend.
and the cold, indifferent mathematics of
This
gravity.
missile represents a
He did
pinnacle
not
of our
yet
engineering
know the
prowess.
solutions,
Its
but he
precision
had
guidance and
already
range are unmatched.
identified the right
Observe the
questions.
aerodynamic
And in
profile and
science,
propulsion
as in
shows our
so much of
strategic
life,
superiority.
knowing the
This
right
prototype
questions
embodies the
is
future
almost
of aviation
everything.
propulsion. Its guidance
The cherry
system ensures
tree.
a precise
Come back
trajectory
to the
the
cherry
target.
tree for a
Come.
moment,
The
because it
horizon awaits
matters
our
more
ascent.
than it might seem. Goddard
This is the
himself
result of
said
years
that
of
when he
research.
climbed down
Its
from that
design is
tree, he
revolutionary
felt
for
as
its
though
time.
he had a
It will change
purpose
the
in
face
life.
of modern
Those were
warfare.
his words.
A new era of
A
defense
purpose,
begins here.
not a dream, not a
This rocket
curiosity,
embodies our
not an
commitment to
interest,
pushing the boundaries
a
of
purpose.
exploration.
There is something
Powerful
almost
engines and advanced
religious in
design
that
will carry us
language,
to new
and it is
heights.
not
The future
accidental.
of space is
For
within our
Goddard,
grasp.
the ambition
This
to
rocket
reach
represents
space
the
was
future
never
of our
merely a
nation, symbol of
scientific or
innovation and
engineering
strength.
project.
With its
It was
powerful
something
engines,
closer
it
to
will
a
carry us to
calling,
the stars and
something that
secure our
felt to
place in
him as
history.
inevitable as a vocation feels to a priest or a poet, as though it had been waiting for him, as though the universe had assigned it to him specifically, as though declining it were not really an option.
The
He
possibilities of
carried
tomorrow
that
depend on
feeling
the
with him as he
experiments of
entered
today.
Worcester
Every test
Polytechnic
brings us closer
Institute
to
in
unlocking nature's secrets.
1904.
This
He was
apparatus
22
will
years
change our
old,
understanding of the
older
world.
than his classmates by several years, serious in a way that made some of them uncomfortable, brilliant in a way that made others resentful. He was not, by any account, a natural social creature. He was precise and quiet and fiercely internal, the kind of person whose most intense conversations happen entirely inside his own head. He made friends, but not easily. He found small talk almost physically painful. What he found easy, what he found almost restful, was mathematics and physics, the language of the universe, the only language in which the questions that obsessed him could even begin to be asked. At WPI, Goddard began to formalize what had until then been an almost entirely self-directed education. He encountered professors who recognized his gifts, and a few who were made uneasy by the direction of those gifts. Even in an academic environment, even among people paid to take ideas seriously, the idea of traveling beyond the Earth's atmosphere was still regarded in 1904 as a topic for novelists rather than engineers. When Goddard began tentatively and carefully to suggest that rocket propulsion might one day make space travel a practical reality, the response he received was not encouragement. It was not even dismissal. It was something more painful than both of those things. It was a kind of polite, slightly embarrassed silence. The silence of people who respect you enough not to laugh in your face, but who do not know what to do with what you are saying. He learned to be careful about what he said. He learned to keep the largest and most dangerous parts of his vision private, locked away in journals and notebooks that he filled with a mixture of technical calculations and something that reads in retrospect almost like poetry, the poetry of a man in love with an idea so large that language keeps almost reaching it and then falling back. He learned to present the smaller, more defensible pieces of his vision, the physics, the engineering, the mathematics, while keeping the full scope of his ambition concealed, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he had already learned at a very young age that the world was not ready to hear it. And yet,
This rocket embodies the dreams of
something
generations.
was building.
We stand
Beneath
at the
surface
threshold
of
the
his
stars.
quiet, careful,
Today, we
methodical
take the
student
first step
life,
into the cosmos.
beneath the controlled
The future is
exterior of a
ours.
young man who had learned
This
to
rocket
survive
stands
on
as
the
a testament
margins
to
of
our
a
nation's
world that
resolve.
didn't quite know
It
what
is
to
a
do
shield
with him,
against aggression
something
and a
was
beacon on
building,
technological might.
slowly,
We must press
irresistibly,
forward with
with the
unyielding
patient
determination.
force of something
This rocket is the
geological,
culmination
a
of our
vision,
tireless work.
a plan,
It will carry
a
us
set of
beyond our
ideas that
earthly
would,
bounds.
if he could only
must
find the
proceed with the launch
time and the
without delay.
resources and the
future
solitude to
is now.
develop them, change
We
the
gather here at the
relationship
threshold
between
of a new
human
era.
beings and the
This structure
universe
symbolizes our
forever.
collective strength and vision.
He
Let us press
graduated from
forward, united in
WPI
purpose,
in
to forge a brighter
1908.
tomorrow.
He pursued graduate studies
There
at
she
Clark
stands, a true
University
marvel
just
of
down the
engineering.
road in Worcester,
Look at that, the
earning
engines
his
are
master's
firing
degree
up!
and then his doctorate.
What a sight!
He was a man of his own
Godspeed
city,
on your journey to
rooted
the
and local
stars.
in ways that would
This
later
is a
seem
pivotal
almost
moment in our history.
paradoxical. This man who
vehicle behind me
dreamed
will
of
carry us to
infinite
the stars.
distances, who spent his
Prepare for
entire
launch.
professional life
Look at it
trying
go.
to escape
A
the
new
gravity
era
of the
dawns.
Earth, never
This
really
rocket
escaped the
represents the
gravity of
culmination of
Worcester.
years of research.
He always
Its
came
successful
back.
launch will
He
propel
always
us into a
stayed
new era of
close,
discovery.
as though the
Ignition
smallness of
sequence
the
start.
place were a
Lift
necessary
off.
counterweight to the
There she
enormity of
stands,
the dream.
culmination of our efforts.
And it is here,
Engines primed,
at this
all systems
precise
are go.
moment, as a newly minted doctor of physics standing at the beginning of his professional life, his notebooks
Behold, the
already
pinnacle of our
filling with
engineering
calculations
prowess.
that no
We'll soar
one
to the
around him
heavens,
fully
exploring the
understood,
unknown.
his mind already reaching upward past the clouds, past the atmosphere, into
Behold
the
the
cold,
rocket of
dark
tomorrow.
silence
Its
above.
sleek design and
It is
powerful engine will
here
carry us for
that
the
the
stars.
real story
Observe
begins.
the riveted panels.
Not the
crafted to endure
story of
immense
the
pressures
boy
of
in the
launch.
cherry tree,
This is just
though
the
that
beginning of our
story
journey.
matters too. The real story. The story of what happens when a human being decides, with complete and irreversible conviction, to do something that has never been done before.
All systems go.
Something
Launch
that
in 3,
cannot
2,
be done
1.
according to almost everyone who examines it. Something that the laws of physics, correctly interpreted, actually permit. But
Gentlemen,
the
this
laws of
rocket will
human
carry us to the edge
expectation,
of space.
the laws of
Ignition
institutional
sequence start.
caution,
Thrust is
the
building.
laws of a world
We have
that has
liftoff,
not yet
Fast
learned
Bay.
to imagine what it cannot see, those
This missile
laws
represents the
forbid.
pinnacle of our engineering
He was
prowess.
30 years old.
Its precision
He had a
guidance and range
dream
are
the
unmatched.
size of the solar
Observe
system
the
and a
aerodynamic profile of
laboratory the
propulsion
size of a
shows our
closet
strategic
and a
superiority.
budget that
This
was, to
prototype
put it
embodies the
charitably,
future of aviation propulsion.
aspirational.
Its guidance
The
system
newspapers
ensures a
had not
precise
yet noticed
trajectory
him.
to the
The
target.
government
Come,
had not yet
the
noticed
horizon
him.
awaits our ascent.
History had not yet noticed him.
This is the result of
He was
years of
alone
research.
with his idea
Its design
and his
is revolutionary
mathematics
for its
and
time.
his burning,
It will change the
unshakable
face of modern
certainty
warfare.
that the sky
A new
was
era of
not
defense
the
begins
limit,
here.
that the sky, in fact,
This rocket
was
embodies
only
our
the
commitment to
beginning.
pushing the boundaries of
There is a
exploration.
particular
Its
kind of
powerful engines and
loneliness
advanced
that
design will
belongs
carry us to
only
new
to
heights.
people who can see
future of
something
space
that
is within
no
our
one else
grasp.
can see
This
yet.
rocket represents the
It is
future
not
of
the
our nation,
loneliness of
symbol of
isolation,
innovation and
though
strength.
isolation is
With its
part of
powerful
it.
engines,
It
it
is
will
not the
carry us to the
loneliness of
stars and
rejection,
secure our place
though
in history.
rejection is part of it too. It is something more fundamental than either of those things, a loneliness that lives at the very center of original thought, in the gap between what a mind has
possibilities of
grasped
tomorrow depend
and
on
what
the
the
experiments
world
of
is
today.
prepared to accept.
Every test brings us closer to
Robert
unlocking
Goddard
nature's secrets.
lived inside that
This
gap
apparatus
for
will
most
change
of his
our
adult
understanding
life.
of the world.
He had climbed down from the cherry tree at 17 with a purpose burning in his chest like a second heartbeat. And now, a decade later, standing at the threshold of his professional life with a doctorate in physics and a mind crackling with ideas that the 20th century had not yet caught up to, he was beginning to understand the true cost of that purpose. It was not going to be paid in money, though the money would always be scarce. It was not going to be paid in time, though time would always be the enemy. It was going to be paid in something far more intimate and far more painful than either of those things. It was going to be paid in the slow, grinding, daily experience of being misunderstood by almost everyone he encountered, of carrying something enormous and beautiful and absolutely real inside him, and watching the world look at it and see nothing. But before we go further into what Goddard became, we have to go deeper into what he was. Because the man who would one day stand in a frozen field and watch a metal tube full of liquid fuel tear itself free from the earth and punch upward into the sky, that man was not born fully formed. He was built, the way all human beings are built, out of the specific and unrepeatable materials of a particular childhood, a particular family, a particular set of wounds and gifts and formative encounters with the world. And some of those materials were stranger and more complex than the history books tend to acknowledge. Go back for a moment to Worcester. Go back to the house on Maple Hill where young Robert spent so many of his childhood hours. It was a house that smelled, depending on the season, of wood smoke and clean linen and his mother's medicine and the particular dry paper smell of books that have been read many times. It was a house where the sounds of the outside world, the horses on the cobblestones, the factory whistles, the shouts of children playing in the street, came in through the windows muffled and slightly unreal, as though the outside world were something that happened to other people in another story.
This rocket embodies the
Robert
dreams of
Goddard
generations.
was a child who
We stand
lived
at the
primarily
threshold of the
in
stars.
interior space,
Today, we take the
not
first
because
step
he
into
was
the cosmos.
unhappy,
Though he
future
was
is
sometimes
ours.
unhappy in
This
the
rocket
particular
stands as a
way of
testament to our
children
nation's
whose
resolve.
inner world is
It
so
is a
much
shield
richer
against
than the
aggression
outer
and a beacon
world
on
that the
technological
outer
might.
world keeps
We must press
disappointing them.
forward with unyielding
But because his mind was simply
rocket is
more
the
interesting to
culmination of our
him than
tireless
almost
work.
anything the
It will carry us
external
beyond our
environment had
earthly
to
bounds.
offer.
We must
This
proceed
is
with the
not
launch
an
without
uncommon
delay.
trait in
The
people who
future is
go
now.
on to do
We
extraordinary
gather
things.
here at the threshold of
But
a
it
new
comes
era.
with
This
costs that
structure
are
symbolizes
rarely
our collective
tallied
strength and vision.
honestly.
Let us press
A
forward,
child
united
who
in
lives
purpose, to forge
primarily
a brighter
inside
tomorrow.
his own head is a child who
There she
is,
stands,
in
a true
very
marvel of
important ways,
engineering.
practicing solitude. He is building the muscles of aloneness, the ability to
Godspeed on
sit
your
with a
journey to the
problem for
stars.
hours,
This is
days,
a pivotal
weeks,
moment in our
without
history.
needing external
The vehicle behind me
validation
will
or
carry us to the
companionship to
stars.
keep going.
Prepare for launch.
Those muscles would
Look at it
serve
go.
Robert
A
Goddard
new era
enormously
dawns.
in his
This
professional
rocket
life.
represents the
They
culmination
would allow
of years
him
of
to
research.
persist through
Its
years
successful
of
launch will
failure
propel us
and
into a new era
ridicule
of
and
discovery.
institutional
Ignition
indifference
sequence start.
without breaking,
Liftoff!
without abandoning his
There she
vision,
stands, the
without
culmination
doing
of our
what almost
efforts.
any other
Engines
person in
primed,
his
all systems
position
a
would
go.
have done, which was to give up and go find something more achievable to pursue. But those same
Behold, the
muscles,
pinnacle of our
that
engineering
same
prowess.
deep
It will
capacity
soar
for
to the heavens,
solitude
exploring
would
the
also
unknown.
cost him. They would make him cautious about trust in a way that bordered sometimes
Behold
on
the rocket of
paranoia.
tomorrow.
They
Its
would
sleek
make
design
him
and powerful
guarded
engine will
about
carry
his
us to the
work in a
stars.
way that
Observe the
ironically
riveted panels, crafted
slowed
to
the
endure the
very
immense pressures of
project
launch.
he was trying
This
to
is
advance.
just the beginning of our journey.
They would make him, at times, his own worst obstacle. But that comes later. Stay with the boy for now. Stay with the boy in the quiet house, reading by the window,
All
his mother
systems go.
coughing
Launch in
gently
3,
in the
2,
next
1.
room,
Gang!
the winter pressing cold and hard against the glass. His relationship with his father deserves
Gentlemen,
more
this rocket will
attention than
carry
it
us to
typically
the edge
gets.
of space.
Nahum
Ignition sequence
Goddard
start.
was not a
Thrust is
man of
building.
grand gestures
We
or
have
eloquent
liftoff,
declarations, but he was a man who paid attention.
This missile
And what he
represents the
paid
pinnacle of our
attention to,
engineering
above
prowess.
all else,
Its
was his
precision,
son.
guidance, and range are
He
unmatched.
watched Robert with the
Observe the
particular
aerodynamic profile
alertness
and
of a
propulsion
parent
shows our
who
strategic
senses,
superiority.
without quite being
This
able to
prototype embodies the
articulate
future
it,
of
that the
aviation
child in
propulsion.
front
Its
of him
guidance
is
system
operating
ensures a
on a
precise
frequency that
trajectory
the
to the
rest of the
target.
world
Come,
cannot quite
the
receive.
horizon awaits our ascent.
He encouraged Robert's reading.
This is the
He
result
brought him
of years
books.
of research.
He brought him,
Its design
and this
is
detail is
revolutionary for
almost
its time.
unbearably
It will
poignant
change
in
the face of
retrospect,
modern warfare.
a telescope,
A new era of
a
defense
small
begins
brass telescope
This
purchased
rocket
from a
embodies our
catalog,
commitment to
which
pushing the
Robert
boundaries of
immediately
exploration.
aimed at the night
powerful
sky
engines
with an
and advanced design
intensity
will carry
that
us to
made
new
his
heights.
father quietly
The future of
proud
space
and
is within our
quietly
grasp.
afraid at the
This
same
rocket
time.
represents the future of our
Proud
nation, a
because the
symbol of
boy's
innovation
hunger
and
was
strength.
unmistakable
With its
and
powerful
magnificent.
engines, it will carry us to the
Afraid
stars
because
and secure
even
our
Nahum
place in
Goddard,
history.
a practical man, a man of machines and business and solid New England common sense, could see that the hunger his son was feeding with that telescope was not the kind of hunger that the world
Possibilities of
easily
tomorrow depend on the
accommodated.
experiments of
It was the
today.
kind of
Every
hunger
test
that could
brings us closer to
consume a
unlocking nature's
person,
secrets.
that could
This
burn a
apparatus
life
will
to the
change our
ground in the
understanding of the
pursuit of
world.
something the world had not yet decided was worth pursuing. But Nahum Goddard did not say this. He gave Robert the telescope, and he watched him use it, and he said nothing, except, according to the accounts that have survived, something to the effect that the stars were worth looking at. That was all. That was enough. Sometimes the most important thing a parent can do is simply refuse to tell their child that the sky is the limit. The telescope changed things. It always does for a certain kind of mind. There is something about the experience of looking through a lens at a sky that suddenly reveals itself to be not a ceiling, but a depth, not a surface, but an infinite recession of light and distance and time, that reorganizes the interior landscape of a susceptible person in ways that cannot be undone. Robert Goddard looked through his father's telescope at the craters of the moon, at the rings of Saturn, at the dense powdery arm of the Milky Way, and felt something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite succeeding. It was not wonder exactly, though wonder was part of it. It was more like recognition, as though he was seeing for the first time the place where he actually belonged. Not Worcester, not Massachusetts, not even Earth necessarily, but out there, in the dark, among the stars. He knew even then that this was an absurd feeling. He was not a child who confused poetry with engineering.
He understood that the distance between a boy in Worcester with a brass telescope and those cold, burning, impossibly distant points of light was not a distance that could be crossed by wanting. It could only be crossed by thinking, by calculating, by building, by doing the long, unglamorous, frequently humiliating work of turning a dream into a machine. And he was above all else prepared to do that work. He had been preparing his whole life without quite knowing it. The years at Clark University were, on the surface, the years of conventional academic achievement. Goddard earned his master's degree in 1910 and his doctorate in 1911, and in both cases his performance was exceptional. He was recognized by his professors as one of the most gifted students they had encountered, a man with an unusual combination of theoretical brilliance and practical engineering instinct that was rarer than either quality alone. He was offered a research fellowship at Princeton, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the country, and he accepted it. He spent a year there, among the finest scientific minds of his generation, and by almost every external measure, it was a success.
But something happened at Princeton that the official record barely acknowledges. Something that would, in retrospect, reveal the particular shape of the struggle that was waiting for Goddard for the rest of his life. He got sick. He got very sick. The tuberculosis that had haunted his mother's life came for him, too, settling into his lungs with the quiet, pitiless efficiency of a disease that knew exactly what it was doing.
This rocket represents
In
the culmination of
1913,
years of
he was
research.
diagnosed.
Its successful
His
launch will
doctors did
propel
not
us
give
into a
him a
new
good
era of
prognosis.
discovery.
Some of
Ignition
them, in
sequence
the
start.
careful and
Lift
compassionate
off.
language of medical men who
There
have
she
learned
stands,
to
the
deliver bad
culmination of our
news
efforts.
without quite
Engines
saying
primed,
it
all
directly,
systems are go.
suggested that he put his affairs in order. He was 31 years old. He had not yet built
Behold,
anything.
the pinnacle
He had
of our
not yet
engineering
published the
prowess.
papers
It will
that
soar
would
to the
lay the
heavens,
theoretical
exploring the
foundation for everything that came after. He had notebooks full of calculations and a mind
Behold,
full
the
of
rocket of
visions
tomorrow.
and a
Its
chest
sleek
full
design
of
and powerful engine
disease
will
that
carry
was
us to the
trying
stars.
with
Observe
considerable
the riveted
determination
panels, crafted to
to
endure the
end
immense
him
pressures of
before
launch.
he had a chance
This is
to
just the
begin.
beginning of our journey.
And here is where Robert Goddard reveals something essential about his character, something that goes beyond ambition, beyond intelligence, even beyond the particular quality of his scientific
All systems
gifts.
go. Launch in
Faced
3,
with
2,
the
1,
real
and-
possibility of death, not the abstract, distant death that most young people understand they will one day encounter, but the immediate,
Gentlemen, this rocket
specific,
will carry us to the
already
edge of
scheduled
space.
death of a
Ignition
man
sequence
whose
start.
lungs are
Thrust is
failing in a
building.
sanitarium in
We
New
have
England.
liftoff,
He did
Lefty.
not give up his work. He could not give up
This
his
missile
work.
represents a
It
pinnacle
was,
of our
by this
engineering
point,
prowess.
too completely
Its precision,
fused
guidance,
with
and range are
whatever it
unmatched.
was that made him
Observe the
him.
aerodynamic profile
To
of
give it
propellant
up
shores
would
our
have been to
strategic
give up
superiority.
something more
This
fundamental
prototype
than a
embodies the
career
future
or
of
an
aviation
ambition.
propulsion.
It would
Its
have been to
guidance
give
system
up the
ensures a
specific
precise
form
trajectory
that
to the
his
target.
life had taken.
Come. The
And
horizon
so,
awaits
in the
our ascent.
sanitarium, in the carefully managed
the result
rest
of
that the
years of
doctors
research.
prescribed,
Its
in the
design
long,
is
quiet
revolutionary for
hours
its
when he was
time.
supposed to be
It will
doing
change
nothing
the face
except
of
allowing
modern
his
warfare.
body to recover,
A new era of defense
Robert
begins
Goddard
here.
filled notebooks.
This
He
rocket embodies
calculated,
our commitment
he
to pushing the
theorized,
boundaries of
he
exploration.
designed in his mind and
powerful
on
engines
paper
and advanced design
engines
will
and
carry us to new
trajectories
heights.
and systems that
The
did
future of
not yet
space is
exist
within our grasp.
anywhere in the physical
This
world
rocket represents
and might
the future
never
of our
exist
nation,
if
a
his
symbol
body
of innovation
continued
and
on its
strength.
current trajectory.
With its powerful
He was
engines, it will
racing
carry
against
us
his
to the
own
stars and
mortality,
secure our
though he
place
would
in
not have
history.
used those words. He would have said, more simply and more characteristically, that there was work to be done. He survived. This is, in the context of early 20th century tuberculosis,
The possibilities
not a
of
trivial
tomorrow
statement.
depend on the experiments
He
of
survived
today.
and he
Every
recovered.
test brings
and
us
he
closer to
returned to
unlocking
Clark
nature's
University
secrets.
in 1914,
This apparatus will
where he
change
would
our
spend
understanding
most
of
of
the
the
world.
rest of his professional life, not because Clark was the most prestigious institution that would have him, but because it gave him something he valued more than prestige. It gave him a laboratory. A small, underfunded, not particularly well-equipped laboratory, but a laboratory nonetheless. A place where he could stop calculating in his head and start building with his hands. The transition from theory to practice is one of the most treacherous passages in all of science and engineering. It is where most grand visions go to die, not because the visions are wrong, but because the physical world is indifferent to elegance and has 1,000 ways of punishing the gap between what the mathematics says should happen and what the materials, the machines, the laws of friction and heat and imprecision actually produce. Goddard understood this.
He had understood it in the abstract for years, but now, in his laboratory at Clark, he began to understand it in the concrete and frequently painful way that only comes from actually building things and watching them fail. And they failed, constantly, magnificently, in ways that would have defeated a person with a less ferocious attachment to the underlying vision. Goddard was working, in these early years, primarily with solid-fuel rockets, essentially sophisticated versions of the skyrockets that had existed for centuries, but engineered with a precision and a theoretical intentionality that was entirely new. He wanted to understand the fundamental physics of rocket propulsion at a level of granularity that no one had previously attempted. He wanted to measure thrust and exhaust velocity and efficiency with scientific rigor, to build a body of experimental data that could inform the next generation of designs. It was meticulous, grinding, repetitive work. It was the opposite of glamorous. It looked nothing like the adventure stories he had read as a sick child in Worcester. It looked like a man in a lab coat surrounded by failed machinery, making notes in a small, precise hand, and then going back to the drawing board, and then building again, and then watching it fail again, and then making more notes. But here's the thing about Robert Goddard that you have to hold on to, because it is the key to everything that comes after. He was not discouraged by failure. This sounds like the kind of thing people say about great scientists and inventors as a form of hagiography, a way of making them seem superhuman, invulnerable, possessed of a confidence in themselves that ordinary mortals cannot access. But in Goddard's case, it was simply true, and it was true for a specific reason that has nothing to do with invulnerability. He was not discouraged by failure because he had a theoretical framework that told him with mathematical certainty that what he was attempting was possible. The failures were not evidence that the project was wrong. They were information. Each failed experiment told him something specific and useful about what the next experiment needed to correct. He was not failing. He was learning at a rate and with a rigor that no one else in the world was matching, because no one else in the world was doing what he was doing. By 1915, he had already made discoveries that would have been headline news if anyone had been paying attention. He had demonstrated experimentally that a rocket could produce thrust in a vacuum, which was, at the time, not universally accepted. There were serious scientists, educated and credentialed and respected, who believed that a rocket could only work by pushing against the air, and that therefore space travel was impossible on purely physical grounds because there was no air in space to push against. Goddard proved them wrong. He proved them wrong in a small room in Worcester, Massachusetts, with equipment that cost almost nothing, and he wrote up his findings with the careful understatement of a man who has learned not to make large claims in public, and almost no one noticed. He kept working. He kept building. He kept filling notebooks with calculations that were, in their combination of theoretical sophistication and practical engineering detail, years ahead of anything being produced anywhere else in the world. And all the while, beneath the controlled surface of the working scientist, beneath the methodical patience of the experimenter, the dream was still there, unchanged, undiminished, burning with the same intensity it had burned with in the branches of a cherry tree on a cold October afternoon 16 years before. The dream of going up, the dream of the dark and the cold and the infinite silence, the dream of a machine that could carry a human being, or at least the instruments of human curiosity, beyond the thin blue shell of the atmosphere and into the vast, waiting, unimaginably beautiful universe beyond. He was getting closer, not in weeks, not in months, in the geological time of a great ambition that refuses to be hurried, but closer. And the closer he got, the more he felt the twin pressures that would define the next phase of his life. The pressure of the work itself, which was consuming and all-demanding and never satisfied, and the pressure of the world outside the laboratory, which was beginning, slowly and not always kindly, to notice what he was doing. He had applied in 1916 to the Smithsonian Institution for a research grant, $5,000, a modest sum even by the standards of the day. He had
Every
written
test
a
brings us
paper,
closer to
careful
unlocking
and
nature's
precise and
secrets.
deliberately
This
conservative
apparatus
in its
will change
claims,
our understanding
laying
of the
out
world.
his theoretical framework for high-altitude rocket research. He had titled it, with a characteristic mixture of ambition and understatement, A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. The Smithsonian had funded him. It was the first official recognition he had ever received, the first time any institution of standing had looked at what he was doing and said, however tentatively, however hedgingly, that it might be worth supporting. He accepted the money with gratitude and went back to work, because the work was what mattered. The work had always what mattered. The grants and the recognition and the institutional support, these things were means to an end, fuel for the engine of the real project, which was not about prestige or validation or professional advancement. It was about something so much larger and stranger and more fundamental than any of those things. It was about a question that had been burning in Robert Goddard's mind since he was a boy looking up at the night sky through a small brass telescope, a question that no amount of professional success or academic recognition could touch, a question that could only be answered by building something and lighting it and watching it rise. Could it be done? Could a human-made machine actually escape the gravity of this earth? Could the dream that had seemed for all of human history like the most beautiful and the most impossible of fantasies, could that dream be made real? Not in a novel, not in a calculation, in the physical world, in metal and fire and mathematics and the cold, absolute judgment of the laws of physics. He believed the answer was yes. He had always believed the answer was yes. But believing was not enough. It had never been enough. And so he built, and he failed, and he built again. And somewhere in the distance, not yet visible, not yet real, but coming, unmistakably coming, the moment was approaching when the believing and the building would finally, at enormous cost and after unimaginable effort, converge. The world did not know it yet. The world was busy with other things, with wars and economies and the 10,000 urgent concerns of ordinary human life. The world had not yet learned to look up. But in a small laboratory in Worcester, Massachusetts, a
This
quiet
rocket
and
embodies the
serious
dreams of
and
generations.
utterly
We
relentless
stand
man
at the threshold
was
of the
about to give it a
stars.
reason to.
Today, we
There
take the
is
first
a
step into
moment
the
in the
cosmos.
life of every
future
great
is
endeavor
ours.
when the work
This
stops
rocket
being
stands as a
theoretical
testament to our
and
nation's
becomes
resolve.
physical.
It is a shield against
When the
depression and a
equations
beacon on
leave the
technological
page
light.
and enter the
We must
world,
press forward with
when the
unyielding
dream
determination.
for the first time
This rocket
has to
is the
survive
culmination of our
contact
tireless
with
work.
reality,
It will
with
carry us
metal
beyond
that
our
cracks
earthly
under
bounds.
pressure,
We
with
must
fuel
proceed
that
with the launch
burns
without delay.
unpredictably, with the
future is
thousand
now.
small betrayals
We
of the
gather here at the
material
threshold of
world
a new era.
that no
This
calculation,
structure
however
symbolizes our
brilliant,
collective strength
can
and vision.
fully
Let us press
anticipate.
forward, united in
For
purpose,
Robert
to
Goddard,
forge a brighter
that
tomorrow.
moment was not a single day
There she
or a
stands,
single
a true marvel
experiment.
of engineering.
It was a long,
Look at that, the engines are
grinding,
firing
frequently brutal passage that lasted years, a
Godspeed on your
passage through
journey to the
failure
stars.
after failure
This is a
after
pivotal
failure,
moment in our history.
through cold and
The vehicle behind
frustration,
me will carry
and
us
the
to the
particular
stars.
despair of a
Prepare
man who
for
can see
launch.
exactly
Look
where
at it
he
go.
needs to go
A new era
and cannot,
dawns.
for reasons
This
that
rocket
keep
represents
changing,
the culmination
get
of years
there.
of research.
It was
Its
the
successful
passage
launch
that
will propel us
separates the
into a new
dreamers
era of discovery.
from the builders.
Ignition sequence
And Goddard,
start.
whatever
Lift
else he
off!
was a builder.
There she stands.
He had
the
always
culmination
been
of
a
our
builder,
efforts.
and so
Engines
he
primed,
went
all
through
systems
it.
a go.
He went through all of it, and what came out the other side was something the world had never seen before.
Behold,
The
the
years
pinnacle of our
immediately
engineering
following
prowess.
the First
It will
World
soar to the
War
heavens,
were, for most
exploring the
Americans,
unknown.
years of exhaustion and relief, and the tentative, uncertain business of returning
Behold the
to
rocket
normal
of tomorrow.
life.
Its sleek
The
design
war
and
had
powerful engine will carry us
consumed
to the
everything,
stars. Observe
men
the riveted
and
panels,
money
crafted
and
to endure the immense
industrial
pressures of launch.
capacity, and the
This is just the
particular
beginning of our
kind of
journey.
optimism that believes the world is fundamentally improvable, that human beings are capable of organizing themselves towards something better than mutual destruction. That optimism
systems go.
had not
Launch in
survived
3,
the
2, 1.
trenches. The 1920s would be, in many ways, a decade of compensatory pleasure, of jazz and dancing,
this rocket
and the
will carry us to
deliberate,
the edge of
almost
space.
aggressive
Ignition
pursuit of
sequence start.
enjoyment
Thrust is
by
building.
people who had seen too
We have
much
liftoff.
and needed to
Perfect.
feel something other than grief. It
This
was
missile
not, on the
represents the pinnacle
surface,
of our
a
engineering
decade that
prowess.
had much patience for
precision
the
guidance
long,
and range are
slow,
unmatched.
unglamorous
Observe
work
the
of
aerodynamic
scientific
profile that
research.
propulsion shows
It
our
was a
strategic
decade that
superiority.
wanted results,
This prototype
that
embodies the
wanted
future of
spectacle,
aviation propulsion.
that wanted
Its
to be
guidance system
dazzled.
ensures a
Robert
precise
Goddard was
trajectory to
not,
the
by
target.
nature
Come,
or by
the
training,
horizon
a
awaits
man
our
who
ascent.
provided spectacle.
He was a
This is
man
the
who
result of
provided
years of
precision.
research.
And
Its
in the
design
culture
is
of the
revolutionary for its
1920s,
time.
these were
It will
very
change the
different
face
things.
of modern
He had
warfare.
returned to
A
Clark
new era of
University
defense
after the
begins here.
war with a clearer sense
This
than
rocket
ever of
embodies
what
our
he
commitment
needed to
to pushing
do,
the boundaries
and a
of
grimmer
exploration.
sense than ever
Its
of how
powerful engines
difficult
and
it was
advanced
going
design
to
will
be
carry
to
us
do
new
it.
heights.
The
future of
Smithsonian
space
grant
is
had
within
given
our
him a
grasp.
foundation,
This
but
rocket
only
represents the
barely.
future of our
He was
nation, a
working
symbol
with
of
limited
innovation and
equipment,
strength.
a tiny
With its
staff,
powerful engines, it
essentially
will
just
carry us to the
himself and a
stars and
handful of
secure our
student
place in history.
assistants who helped him with the physical work of construction and testing, and a budget that required him to make every dollar perform the work of three. He was also working increasingly in secret,
possibilities of
not
tomorrow
because he
depend on
had
the
anything to
experiments of
hide
today.
in any
Every test
dishonorable
brings us
sense,
closer to
but because
unlocking
he had
nature's
developed
secrets.
through years
This
of
apparatus will
experience
change
a
our
deep
understanding
and not
of the world.
entirely unjustified suspicion of premature publicity. He had seen what happened when an idea reached the public before it was ready to survive public scrutiny. He had seen the mockery that greeted unconventional scientific claims. He was determined that when the world finally saw what he was building, it would not be able to dismiss it. It would have to reckon with it. And that meant the work had to be finished, or at least far enough along, before anyone outside his small circle of collaborators knew what it was. This secrecy was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential decisions of his career. It protected him, in the short term, from the kind of public ridicule that might have made his institutional position untenable, but it also isolated him in ways that would have significant costs down the road, costs measured not just in his own professional struggles, but in the broader development of rocket science as a field. Goddard was, during these years, probably the most advanced rocket researcher in the world. He was certainly the most rigorously experimental, but because he published rarely and shared his findings even more rarely, his work was not building the kind of cumulative, collaborative scientific momentum that might have accelerated everything. He was, in a very real sense, doing alone what an entire research program might have done faster and better, with more hands and more minds. He knew this on some level, but he could not bring himself to open the laboratory doors. The fear of theft, of misappropriation, of seeing his ideas taken and credited to someone else, that fear was real and not entirely irrational, and it kept the doors closed. Inside those closed doors, the work was moving. Slowly, painfully, with the lurching, 2 steps forward, 1 step back rhythm of genuinely original engineering, but moving. Goddard had shifted his focus during these years from solid-fueled rockets to something far more ambitious and far more technically demanding, liquid-fueled rockets. This shift was not arbitrary. It was the product of years of careful analysis and a conclusion that was, in retrospect, obviously correct, but was, at the time, far from
This
obvious
rocket
to
embodies
anyone
the
else.
dreams of generations.
Solid
We
fuels,
stand at the
essentially
threshold of the
gunpowder in
stars.
various more
Today, we take
sophisticated
the first step into the
formulations,
cosmos.
were inherently limited.
future is
They
ours.
burned fast and hot
rocket
and
stands
without
as a testament
control.
to our nation's
Once you
resolve.
lit them, you
It
could
is a
not
shield against
adjust the
aggression
burn
and a
rate,
beacon on
could not
technological
throttle
light.
the engine,
We must
could not
press forward
stop
with
and
unyielding
restart.
determination.
They were, in
This rocket is
engineering
the
terms,
culmination of our
blunt
tireless
instruments,
work. It
powerful
will carry us
but blunt.
beyond our earthly
For the
bounds.
kind of
We
precision
must proceed
flight
with
that
the launch
Goddard
without
envisioned,
delay.
for rockets
The
that could be
future is now.
steered, that could carry
We gather
instruments
here at
to
the threshold of
specific
a new era.
altitudes, that could
This
one
structure
day
symbolizes our
carry
collective
human
strength and
beings
vision.
on
Let us
journeys
press
that
forward,
required the
united in
kind of
purpose,
fine
to forge a brighter
control
tomorrow.
that the difference between life and
There she
death
stands, a
demanded.
true marvel of
Solid
engineering.
fuels were
Look at
simply
that, the
not
engines
good
are
enough.
firing up!
Liquid fuels,
off, what
and
a
Goddard
sight!
settled on, after
Godspeed on your
extensive
journey to the
analysis,
stars.
on gasoline and
This is a
liquid
pivotal moment
oxygen
in our
as his
history.
propellants of choice,
The vehicle behind me
could be
will carry
fed
us to the
into a
stars.
combustion chamber
Prepare
at
for
controlled
launch.
rates, could be
Look at it
throttled
go.
up and
A
down,
new era dawns.
could, in principle,
This
be
rocket
shut off
represents the
and
culmination of
restarted.
years of research.
They offered the
Its
possibility
successful
of
launch
an
will
engine
propel
that
us
was
into
not
a
just
new era of
powerful,
discovery.
but manageable,
Ignition sequence start.
responsive,
Lift off.
alive in a way that solid
There she stands,
fuels
the
could never
culmination
be.
of our efforts.
But they also
Engines
offered
primed,
a
all
set of
systems a go.
engineering challenges that made the
Ignition
solid fuel
stop.
problems look almost trivial by comparison. Liquid
Behold,
oxygen
the
had to
pinnacle
be
of our
stored
engineering
at
prowess.
temperatures
It
so
will soar to
cold
the heavens,
they made
exploring
winter
the
in
unknown.
Worcester feel tropical. The pumps and valves and feed systems required to move the propellants
Behold the rocket
into
of
the
tomorrow.
combustion
Its
chamber
sleek design
at
and powerful engine
precisely
will
the
carry
right
us to the
rates
stars.
were
Observe
engineering
the ribbon
problems
panels,
of
crafted to endure
enormous
the immense pressures of
complexity.
launch.
The
This is just
combustion
the beginning of
chamber
our journey.
itself had to withstand temperatures and pressures that pushed the boundaries of what the available materials could handle. And all of this had to work simultaneously, reliably, repeatedly,
systems go.
not in a
Launch in 3, 2,
laboratory
1.
setting with time to carefully diagnose each failure, but in the furious, unforgiving milliseconds of an actual rocket
Gentlemen,
burn.
this rocket
He
will
worked on
carry
these
us to the edge of
problems with the
space.
focused,
Ignition
almost
sequence start.
meditative
Thrust is
intensity
building.
of a man who
We have
has
left
decided
off
that there is
that
nothing else in the world worth thinking about.
This missile
He worked
represents
in
a
the
pinnacle
morning,
of our
and he
engineering
worked in the
prowess.
evening,
Its
and he
precision,
worked
guidance,
in the
and range
space
unmatched.
between sleeping and
Observe the
waking,
aerodynamic
when the
profile of
conscious
the propulsion
mind
shows our
loosens its
strategic
grip on
superiority.
what it knows
This
and
prototype
allows
embodies
the
the future
deeper
of aviation
intelligence to
propulsion.
move more
Its guidance
freely.
system ensures a
He
precise
filled
trajectory
notebooks
to the
with
target.
designs
Come,
and
the
redesigns,
horizon
with
awaits our ascent.
calculations and recalculations,
This is the
with
result
the
of
small
years of
incremental
research.
improvements
Its design
that are
is
the true
revolutionary for its
texture of
time.
engineering
It will change
progress,
the face of
not the
modern
dramatic
warfare.
leaps of
A new
popular
era of defense
mythology,
begins
but
here.
the patient, millimeter
rocket
by
embodies our
millimeter
commitment to
advance
pushing
of
the
a
boundaries
mind
of
that will
exploration.
not stop.
Its
And
powerful
he had
engines and
help
advanced
now
design
in the
will carry
form
us
of a
to new
person
heights.
who deserves
The
far
future of
more
space
credit
is
than
within our
history
grasp.
has typically
This
given her.
rocket represents the
Her
future
name
of
was
our nation,
Esther
a symbol
Kisk,
of innovation
and she
and strength.
became, in
With its powerful
1924,
engines, it
Robert
will carry us
Goddard's
to the
wife.
stars and secure
She was
our
the
place in
daughter of a
history.
local family, intelligent and steady, and possessed of a particular kind of practical courage that complemented Goddard's more interior brand of fortitude. She became almost
Possibilities of
immediately
tomorrow
not just
depend
her
on the
partner in
experiments of
life,
today.
but her
Every
partner
test
in
brings
work,
us closer to
managing
unlocking
his
nature's
correspondence,
secrets.
keeping
This
his
apparatus will
records,
change our
photographing
understanding of
his
the world.
experiments, navigating the administrative and bureaucratic complexities of grant applications and institutional relationships that Goddard found almost physically painful to deal with. She was, in a very real sense, the person who made it possible for him to do what he did. Every photograph we have of Goddard's rockets, every record of his experiments that survived to inform the next generation of rocket scientists, Esther made those things possible. She was the institutional memory of a project that might otherwise have left far fewer traces. And she loved him clearly and completely, and with a patience that the word patience barely captures, through all the years of failure and ridicule and financial uncertainty that lay ahead. In 1925, Goddard made a breakthrough. Not the breakthrough, not the moment that would change everything, the moment that was still months away, but a breakthrough nonetheless, a step so significant that it deserves to be understood in its full context. He successfully tested in his Clark University laboratory a liquid-fueled rocket engine that produced stable, sustained, controllable combustion. It sounds simple. It was not simple. It was the culmination of years of failed attempts, of engines that exploded, that burned through their own walls, that produced thrust for a fraction of a second before catastrophically failing. It was the first time in the history of human engineering that a liquid-fueled rocket engine had been made to work in a reliable, repeatable way. And Goddard stood in his laboratory and looked at it and felt what? We know what he wrote in his journal that night. He wrote that it was satisfactory. That was the word, satisfactory. The understatement is so extreme it becomes almost a form of art.
But satisfactory was not enough. An engine that worked on a test stand was not a rocket. A rocket had to fly. And making something fly, making it leave the Earth under its own power, under controlled conditions, in a way that could be measured and documented and built upon, that was a different order of problem entirely. Goddard knew this. He had always known
This
this.
rocket embodies
and so,
the dreams
in the
of
months that
generations.
followed that
We
first
stand at the
successful
threshold of
engine
the
test,
stars.
he turned his
Today,
full
we take
attention
the
to the
first step into
problem
the
of the
cosmos.
complete vehicle,
The future
the
is
fuel
ours.
tanks, the combustion
This rocket
chamber,
stands
the
as a
nozzle,
testament to
the
our
frame,
nation's resolve.
the ignition system,
It is a
the
shield
launch
against
mechanism.
aggression and a beacon
All
on
of it
technological
had to
might.
work
We
together
must press forward with
simultaneously
unyielding
in the
determination.
span of a few seconds
This rocket
in
is the
conditions of
culmination of our
extreme
tireless
heat and
work.
pressure and
It will carry us
vibration
beyond
that would
our
stress
earthly bounds.
every component
We
to
must
its
proceed with the
absolute
launch
limit
without
and
delay.
beyond.
The future
He tested
is now.
components individually,
We gather here
then
at
in
the threshold of a new
combinations,
era.
then in near
This structure
complete
symbolizes
assemblies.
our collective
He
strength and
failed
vision.
repeatedly.
Let us press forward,
Each
united in
failure was
purpose,
different,
to forge a brighter
different
tomorrow.
system, a different point of weakness,
There she
a
stands,
different
a true
lesson.
marvel of
He
engineering.
learned from
Look at
every
that,
one of
the
them.
engines are
He kept
firing
going.
up!
Esther kept photographing. The notebooks kept filling.
Godspeed on your journey
The
to
winter of
stars.
1925
This is a
gave
pivotal
way
moment
to
in
the
our
winter of
history.
1926,
The vehicle behind me
and the
will carry
rocket
us to
that
the
Goddard
stars.
had been building in his
Prepare for
mind
launch.
since he was a boy
Look
in
at
a
it
cherry
go.
tree
A new
was,
era
for the
dawned.
first time in his life,
This rocket
a
represents the
physical
culmination
object
of
that
years of
existed
research.
in the world
Its successful
rather than
launch will
merely in
propel
his
us into a new
imagination.
era of discovery.
It was crude
Ignition
by any
sequence
later
start.
standard.
Lift
It was a
off.
strange-looking thing. The
There she
fuel
stands,
tanks at the top
culmination
and
of our
the engine
efforts.
at the bottom,
Engines primed, all
connected by
systems a
feed
go.
lines,
Engine
mounted in a
system.
skeletal launch frame that looked more like a piece of farm equipment than anything that belonged in the
Behold,
sky.
the pinnacle of our
It was
engineering
not beautiful,
prowess.
but it
It will
was
soar
real.
to the heavens,
And on the
exploring the
morning of
unknown.
March 16, 1926, Robert Goddard drove it out to a farm in Auburn, Massachusetts,
the rocket of
a
tomorrow.
farm that
Its
belonged
sleek
to his
design
Aunt
and powerful
Effie,
engine will
a
carry us
woman
to
of
the stars.
considerable
Observe the
tolerance for
riveted
her
panels,
nephew's
crafted to endure the
unusual
immense pressures
hobbies.
of launch.
And he set
This
it
is
up
just
in a
the beginning of our journey.
snow-covered field, and he prepared to find out if the last 27 years of his life had meant anything at all. It was cold. It is almost always cold in Massachusetts in March,
systems
and
go.
March
Launch in
16,
3, 2, 1,
1926 was no exception. The sky was clear and pale, and the snow on the ground was hard and crystalline, and the
Gentlemen,
breath
this
of the
rocket
small
will
group
carry
of
us to the
people
edge of
present,
space.
Goddard,
Ignition sequence
Esther,
start.
and two
Thrust is
assistants,
building.
made small clouds in the
liftoff,
frigid air.
Rocketry.
There was no crowd. There was no press. There
This
were no
missile
government
represents the pinnacle
officials,
of our
no
engineering
scientific
prowess.
observers,
Its
no
precision, guidance, and
representatives
range
of
are
any
unmatched.
institution that might
Observe
later
the
wish it
aerodynamic
had been
profile of the
present.
propulsion shields
There was
our
a man
strategic
and his
superiority.
rocket, and his
This
wife,
prototype
and
embodies
two
the future of
assistants,
aviation
and a
propulsion.
frozen
Its
field in
guidance system ensures
Massachusetts,
a precise
and the
trajectory to
accumulated
the
weight
target.
of a dream
Come,
that had been
the
waiting
horizon
almost
awaits our
3
ascent.
decades for this moment.
This is the
Goddard
result
lit
of
the
years
igniter,
of research.
and for a moment,
design
a
is
moment that
revolutionary
must
for
have
its
felt
time.
to
It will
everyone
change
present
the
like
face
the
of modern
longest
warfare.
moment in the
A new
history
era
of
of
time.
defense begins
Nothing
here.
happened. The
This rocket
flame
embodies
flickered
our
at the
commitment
base
to
of the
pushing the
engine.
boundaries
The
of
propellants
exploration.
began to flow,
Its powerful
and
engines
then
and
the
advanced
engine
design will
caught
carry us to
fully
new
and
heights.
completely
The
with a
future of
roar
space
that was
is within our
startling
grasp.
even to people who
This
had been
rocket
present
represents the
at
future
dozens
of
of
our
test
nation,
firings,
symbol of
because
innovation and
this was
strength.
different from a
With
test
its
firing.
powerful engines,
This
it will
was the
carry us
real
to the
deal.
stars and secure
This
our
was the
place in
moment,
history.
and the rocket lifted. It actually lifted. It came free of the launch frame, and it rose into the cold March air, and it flew for 2.5 seconds to an altitude of 41
possibilities of
feet,
tomorrow
and
depend
then
on
it
the
turned
experiments
and
of
came
today.
down in the snow
Every test brings
about
us closer to
180
unlocking
feet from
nature's
the launch
secrets.
point.
This apparatus will
2.5
change our
seconds,
understanding of the
41
world.
feet, 180 feet of horizontal distance. It sounds modest. It sounds, by any conventional measure of achievement, almost absurdly modest. A machine that traveled 41 feet vertically before falling over in a field. But you have to understand what it actually was. You have to understand that it was the first time in the entire history of the human species that a liquid-fueled rocket had left the ground. It was the first time that the propulsion system that would one day power the vehicles that carried human beings to the moon had proven itself in free flight. It was, in the precise and unambiguous language of engineering history, a first. Not a first for America, not a first for the 20th century, a first for the species, a first for all of human time. And it happened in the snowy field in Massachusetts, witnessed by 4 people, recorded by a single camera, and greeted by the world with complete and total silence. Because the world did not know. Goddard did not tell the world. He wrote it up in his notebook. The entry is brief, precise, almost clinical, and then in the margin, almost as an afterthought, there is a small notation that reads simply, "First flight." And he packed up his equipment and drove back to Worcester and went back to work, because 41 feet was not the moon. 41 feet was a proof of concept, an extraordinarily important proof of concept, a proof of concept that changed the theoretical landscape of what was possible in ways that would take decades to fully unfold. But still, just a proof of concept. There was so much more to do. And the world, when it eventually found out, when Goddard finally published his findings, when the Smithsonian released the report, when the newspapers got hold of the story, the world did not respond the way you might expect. The world did not respond with wonder or admiration or the kind of awed recognition that this moment in retrospect so obviously deserved. The world responded with mockery. the New York Times published an editorial, and now infamous editorial, one that the Times would not formally retract until the day after Apollo 11 left the Earth's atmosphere, suggesting that Goddard lacked even the basic high school physics knowledge necessary to understand that a rocket could not work in a vacuum because there was nothing to push against. The editorial was wrong in every particular. It was wrong in its physics, wrong in its engineering, wrong in its understanding of what Goddard had actually demonstrated. It was wrong with the particular confident wrongness of people who have not done the work and cannot imagine that someone else has done it correctly. Goddard read it. He kept a clipping of it. He did not respond publicly. It was not his way to respond publicly, to engage in the kind of rhetorical combat that public dispute required. But he felt it. Of course he felt it. He was not made of stone. He was a man who had given the better part of his adult life to this work, who had risked his health and his professional reputation and the goodwill of every institution that might have supported him in pursuit of something he knew with absolute certainty was real and important and achievable. And the newspaper of record in the greatest city in the country had just told its readers that he was an ignoramus who didn't understand basic physics. Of course he felt it. But here is the remarkable thing, the truly remarkable thing, the thing that in many ways defines Robert Goddard more completely than any single achievement or any single moment of triumph. He did not stop. He did not slow down. He did not spend weeks in the kind of wounded, paralyzed despair that most people would have spent weeks in after that kind of public humiliation. He went back to his laboratory, and he looked at his rocket, and he thought about what needed to be improved, and he began improving it. Because 41 feet was not enough. It had never been enough. The dream had always been larger than 41 feet, larger than any altitude his current rockets could reach, larger, always stubbornly, magnificently larger than anything the world was prepared to believe was possible. He needed more altitude. He needed better engines and better guidance systems and better fuel tanks and 100 other improvements, each one of which would take months or years to develop and test. He needed money he didn't have, and time he couldn't manufacture, and support from institutions that were still not sure whether he was a visionary or a crank. He needed, in short, everything that he didn't have, except the one thing he had always had, the one thing that no editorial, and no mockery, and no institutional indifference could touch. He needed the dream, and the dream was still there. It had always been there. It was there in the morning when he drove to his laboratory, and it was there in the evening when he drove home, and it was there in the space between sleeping and waking, burning with the same intensity it had burned with since a boy in Worcester looked up through the branches of a cherry tree and felt the future reaching down toward him like a hand. He reached back. He had always reached back, and now, for the first time, the universe had reached back too. Just briefly. Just for 2.5 seconds in a frozen field in Massachusetts, just 41 feet of cold March air between the ground and the beginning of everything. But it was enough to know that it was real. It was enough to know that the mathematics had been right, that the dream had been right, that all those years of quiet and grinding and solitary and mocked and misunderstood work had been right. It was real. It could be done. And if it could be done at 41 feet, then it could be done at 4,000 feet. And if it could be done at 4,000 feet, then the rest was only a matter of time and work and the particular brand of relentless, undefeatable persistence that Robert Hutchings Goddard had been building inside himself since he was a child who could not go outside and so learned instead to go up. The rocket had flown. The dream had a body now. And somewhere above the pale Massachusetts sky, past the clouds, past the cold, thin air at the edge of the atmosphere, the stars were not waiting anymore.
There is a particular cruelty in being right too early, in having seen something clearly, precisely, completely, in having done the work to prove it, survived the mockery that greeted the proof, and continued building long after most people would have stopped, and then watching the world begin to catch up, not with gratitude, not with the kind of recognition that might feel after so many years of struggle like justice, but with a combination of sudden, intense interest and profound institutional ambivalence that is, in its own way, almost as isolating as the original indifference had been. Robert Goddard spent the late 1920s and the 1930s living inside exactly this cruelty. The world had decided, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, that rockets were interesting, that the man in Worcester might be onto something, that the work deserved a closer look, and so the world moved closer. And Goddard, who had spent his entire career learning to work alone, found that being looked at was not the same as being understood, and that being funded was not the same as being trusted, and that fame, when it finally arrived, brought with it complications that obscurity had never imagined. The flight of March 16, 1926 had not, as we have seen, produced immediate recognition, but it had produced something. It had produced a record, Goddard's own meticulous documentation, the photographs that Esther had taken, the notebooks that contained every detail of the design and the test and the result, and that record existed in the world now, even if the world was not yet paying attention to it. And Goddard, having proven to himself that the liquid-fueled rocket could fly, had turned his attention with renewed ferocity to the question of how to make it fly better, higher, longer, with more control, with the kind of precision that would transform a curiosity into a tool. He continued his tests in the Auburn field, with Esther photographing and his small team of assistants managing the logistics, and each new rocket was more sophisticated than the last. Longer ranges, higher altitudes, more complex systems of guidance and control. He was not just building rockets, he was building rocket science, almost from scratch, almost entirely alone, in a frozen field in Massachusetts. The neighbors were becoming a problem. This is one of those details that the heroic narrative of scientific progress tends to omit because it is too mundane and too comic to fit comfortably into the story of a visionary genius. But it is true, and it is revealing. The rockets were loud. They were sometimes frighteningly loud. The roar of a liquid-fueled engine at full thrust is not a sound that suburban New England in the 1920s was equipped to receive calmly. There were complaints. There were visits from local fire officials who had concerns about the quantities of liquid oxygen being stored on private property. There were newspaper stories, local ones initially, of the cheerfully bewildered variety that small-town papers produced when something genuinely strange happened in their community. And eventually, in 1929, there was an incident serious enough to attract the attention of the state authorities after one of Goddard's test flights produced a noise and a flash that prompted multiple calls to the local fire department and a visit from officials who suggested, with the particular diplomatic firmness of people who are trying very hard not to say what they actually mean, that perhaps Professor Goddard might want to find somewhere else to conduct his experiments. This was a crisis, not a catastrophic one in retrospect, but it felt like one at the time. Goddard needed space, physical space, open space where he could test rockets without alarming civilians or attracting the kind of official attention that might result in restrictions on his work. He needed somewhere remote and flat and dry, with the kind of long sight lines that allowed you to see a rocket in flight from a safe distance, and the kind of sparse population that would not complain about the noise. He needed, in other words, somewhere that was almost the opposite of Worcester, Massachusetts. The solution, when it came from an unexpected direction. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world, the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone in 1927 and become overnight the most celebrated human being on the planet, had heard about Goddard's work. He was fascinated by it. Lindbergh was not just a pilot, but a genuine enthusiast for the future of flight in all its forms, a man with the imagination to see that what Goddard was doing was not a curiosity, but a foundation, not an experiment, but a beginning. He arranged to visit Goddard in Worcester in late 1929, and the meeting between the two men, the world's most famous aviator and the world's most obscure rocket scientist, was, by all accounts, immediately and genuinely productive. Lindbergh understood what he was looking at. He asked the right questions. He listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who was processing rather than performing. And when he left, he went directly to Daniel Guggenheim, the philanthropist whose fortune had come from copper mining and whose family foundation had already made significant investments in aviation research, and he told him that Robert Goddard was the most important scientist in America that nobody had heard of, and that someone needed to give him money and space to work. Guggenheim listened, and in 1930, Daniel Guggenheim's foundation provided Goddard with a grant, initially $50,000, later extended and increased, that was, by the standards of the time and the field, transformative. $50,000 in 1930 was not a fortune by the standards of industrial research, but it was an enormous amount of money compared to the near nothing that Goddard had been working with for the previous 2 decades. More importantly, it came with the institutional credibility that the Smithsonian's earlier support had only partially provided. This was real money, serious money, the kind of money that said to the world that someone of consequence had looked at what Goddard was doing and decided it was worth backing. And with the money came the space. Goddard and Esther packed up their lives in Worcester and moved to Roswell, New Mexico. It sounds, in the bare statement of it, like a straightforward, practical decision. Find a remote location, set up a new laboratory, continue the work. But there is something almost mythological about the image of Robert Goddard arriving in the high desert of New Mexico,
This rocket embodies
in
the
that
dreams
flat,
of generations.
vast,
We
ancient
stand at the
landscape
threshold of
under
the
its
stars.
enormous sky.
Today, we take
It was
the
as
first
though
step
the
into the
geography
cosmos.
itself were
The
trying
future
to
is
tell him
ours.
something. Worcester
rocket
had been a
stands as a
city of
testament to our
enclosures,
nation's
of
resolve.
houses and
It is a shield
factories and
against
streets
aggression
that
and a
pressed
beacon of
in on all
technological might.
sides,
We
of a
must press
sky that
forward
was
with
always
unyielding
framed
determination.
by something,
This
always
rocket is the
bounded by
culmination
the
of our
buildings and
tireless
the
work.
hills that
It will
surrounded
carry
it.
us beyond our
Roswell
earthly
was the
bounds.
opposite of all
We
that.
must proceed with the launch
Roswell
without
was
delay.
openness.
The future
Roswell
is
was
now.
distance. Roswell
gather
was
here
a
at the
sky
threshold
that
of a
went
new
on
era.
forever in
This
every
structure
direction,
symbolizes our
a
collective strength
horizon
and vision.
so far
Let us press
away that
forward,
it
united
seemed
in purpose,
almost
to forge a brighter
theoretical,
tomorrow.
a silence so complete
There
that
she
on
stands,
still
a true
days
marvel
you
of
could hear
engineering.
your own heartbeat.
The engines are
It was
firing up!
exactly what he needed, and he knew it the moment he
Godspeed on
arrived.
your journey to
He
the
could feel
stars.
it. The space,
This is a
the
pivotal moment in
silence,
our history.
the sense of room
The
to
vehicle
work
behind me
and
will
room
carry
to
us to the
fail
stars.
and room to try
Prepare for
again without
launch.
anyone
Look
close
at it
enough
go.
to notice
A
or
new era
complain.
dawns.
He established
rocket
his
represents the
laboratory at a
culmination of
site he
years of
called
research.
Eden Valley,
Its successful
a name
launch
that
will propel us
reveals
into a new
something
era
about
of
how it
discovery.
felt to him,
Ignition
something
sequence
about
start.
the quality of
Liftoff!
beginning that he associated
There
with
she
it.
stands, the
He brought
culmination
his
of our
small
efforts.
team of
Engines
machinists
primed, all
and
systems a go.
assistants, men who had worked with him
Ignition
long enough to understand not just the technical requirements of the work,
Behold,
but the
the pinnacle
particular
of our
rhythms
engineering
of
prowess.
Goddard's
It
working
will
style,
soar to the heavens,
his
exploring
preference
the
for
unknown.
silence over discussion, his habit of working out problems on paper before committing to any
Behold,
physical
the rocket
action,
of tomorrow.
his
Its sleek
absolute
design and
insistence
powerful engine
and
will carry us to the
precision in
stars.
every measurement
Observe the
and
riveted
every
panels,
record.
crafted to endure the immense
They
pressures
built
of
a
launch.
launch tower.
This is just
They
the beginning
built
of
a
our
machine shop. They built the infrastructure of a research program that was, for the first time in Goddard's career, something that resembled what it actually needed to be. And then they launched
systems go.
rockets,
Launch in
better
3, 2,
rockets
1.
than anything Goddard had built in Worcester, larger, more powerful, more sophisticated in their guidance and control systems.
Gentlemen, this
In
rocket will carry us
1930,
to the
he
edge of
launched a
space.
rocket that
Ignition
reached an
sequence start.
altitude of
Thrust is
2,000
building.
feet and a
We have
speed of
liftoff,
500
Everett.
miles per hour. In 1931,
This
he
missile
surpassed
represents a
that.
pinnacle of our
In
engineering
1932 and
Its precision, guidance, and
1933,
range are unmatched.
despite the interruption
Observe
of a
the
funding
aerodynamic
gap
profile
that
and
forced a
propulsion shows our
temporary
strategic
return to
superiority.
Worcester, he
This prototype
continued
embodies
pushing
the
the
future of
boundaries of
aviation
what his
propulsion.
rockets
Its
could
guidance
do.
system
He
ensures a
developed
precise trajectory to the
gyroscopic
target.
guidance
Come,
systems,
the horizon
mechanisms that
awaits
could
our ascent.
sense the rocket's orientation in
This is
flight
the result
and
of
make
years of
automatic
research.
corrections
Its
to keep it
design
on
is
course.
revolutionary for its
He
time.
developed the
It will
clustered
change the
engine
face of
concept,
modern warfare.
using multiple
A new era of
small
defense
engines to
begins here.
produce greater thrust.
This rocket
He
embodies
developed
our commitment
vanes
to
in the
pushing the
rocket
boundaries of
exhaust,
exploration.
movable surfaces that
powerful
could
engines and
deflect
advanced
the
design will
rocket's
carry us
thrust
to
to
new
steer
heights.
it, a
The future of
concept that
space
would
is
become
within our
standard
grasp.
in the missiles
This
and
rocket
launch
represents the
vehicles of the
future of our
following
nation, a
decades.
symbol of innovation and
Every
strength.
one of these innovations
powerful
was a
engines,
first.
it will carry us
Every
to the
one of them
stars and
represented
secure
a
our place in
solution
history.
to a problem that no one previously solved, because no one had previously been far enough along in the development of liquid-fueled rockets to encounter the problem.
By the mid-1930s,
possibilities of
Robert
tomorrow
Goddard
depend on the
had built
experiments of
rockets
today.
that flew to
Every test brings
altitudes
us
of
closer
over a
to
mile.
unlocking nature's
He had
secrets.
built rockets
This
that
apparatus will
incorporated
change our
gyroscopic
understanding of the world.
stabilization, clustered engines, thrust vector control, regenerative cooling of the combustion chamber, technical solutions that were so far ahead of anything else being developed anywhere in the world that when other rocket programs eventually arrived at the same problems years later, they would independently develop many.
Von Braun and his colleagues had read Goddard's published papers, particularly the 1919 Smithsonian monograph, A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes, which had been translated into German and was widely read in German rocketry circles. They admired Goddard enormously in the abstract, admiring way that scientists admire the work of a predecessor whose contributions they recognize even if they cannot fully access them. But they could not fully access them because Goddard would not let them. When German rocketry researchers wrote to him with questions about his work, he responded with polite but minimal information. When requests came for more detailed technical data, he declined. He was convinced, not without reason, given the political climate of the 1930s, that sharing his technical knowledge with German researchers was a risk he was not prepared to take. What he perhaps did not fully reckon with was the cost of that decision, not just for international rocket science, but for his own position in the story that was unfolding. By keeping his work to himself, he was ensuring that when the history of rocketry was eventually written, it would be written primarily by people who had not read his notebooks, and who would therefore credit to others many of the innovations that Goddard had pioneered first. He was also, in these years, beginning to have difficulties with the American military establishment that would prove both frustrating and, in a different sense, prophetic. Goddard had approached the Army and the Navy multiple times with proposals for military applications of his rocket research, not because he was primarily interested in weapons, but because he understood, with the practical realism that coexisted in him alongside the largest possible vision, that military funding was the most reliable path to the kind of large-scale support his work required. The response from both services was, for most of the 1930s, politely indifferent. The military men who reviewed his proposals were not, in most cases, equipped to evaluate what he was proposing. They were men whose mental models of weapons and propulsion were formed by the technologies of the First World War, by artillery and aircraft, and the established engineering of explosive projectiles. The idea of a rocket that could carry a payload to a specific target with controllable precision was, to most of them, too speculative, too far from anything they had operational experience with, to take seriously as a near-term military proposition. They did not say no exactly. They said, in the particular language of institutional non-commitment, that the work was interesting and that they would keep it in mind. Meanwhile, in Germany, the relationship between rocket research and military ambition was developing along very different lines. The German military, unconstrained by the treaty provisions that limited conventional weapons development, had identified rockets as a potential area of strategic advantage and had begun funding research programs with a seriousness and a scale that dwarfed anything available to Goddard. By the late 1930s, Werner von Braun was working directly for the German army, with access to resources, money, personnel, manufacturing facilities that Goddard could not have imagined. The rockets being developed at the German research facility at Peenemünde were drawing on a body of engineering knowledge that included, whether the Germans fully acknowledged it or not, the published work of Robert Goddard. They were building on his foundation, and they were building faster and bigger and with more institutional support than he was. Goddard knew this. He followed the German rocket program in the public press with the attention of a man watching something he recognizes. watching someone else build
Gentlemen, this
with
rocket
greater
will carry us to the
resources
edge
and
of
fewer
space.
constraints,
Ignition
the
sequence
things
start.
he had been
Thrust is
trying to
building.
build for 30
We have
years.
liftoff,
It was not a comfortable thing to watch. There was pride
This
in it
missile
in a
represents a
complicated
pinnacle
way,
of our engineering
pride that
prowess.
the work he had
Its
done
precision
had
guidance and
contributed
range
to
are
something
unmatched.
real, that the
Observe the
field he had
aerodynamic
essentially
profile and
created
propulsion
was
shows
now
our
large
strategic
enough to
superiority.
attract the
This
attention of
prototype
major
embodies the
governments
future of
and
aviation
serious
propulsion.
military
Its guidance system
establishments,
ensures a
but there
precise
was also
trajectory to the
something
target.
else,
Come,
something
the
darker
horizon
and more
awaits our
personal.
ascent.
The feeling of a man who
This
has
is the
spent his
result of
life
years of
preparing
research.
for a race
Its design
and then
is
arrives at
revolutionary
the
for its
starting
time.
line to
It will
discover that the
change the
race
face
has
of modern
already
warfare.
begun
A
and
new
that the
era of
runners
defense
who got
begins
there
here.
first are running on a
This
track
rocket
he
embodies our
built.
commitment to pushing the
In
boundaries of
1937,
exploration.
he launched a
Its powerful
rocket from
engines and
Roswell
advanced
that
design will
reached an
carry us to new
altitude of
heights.
nearly
The future of
9,000
space
feet,
is within our
almost
grasp.
2 miles
This rocket
above the desert
represents the
floor.
future of our
It was
nation,
his
a symbol of
highest
innovation
flight
and
to
strength.
date, the most
With its
impressive
powerful engines, it will
demonstration of
carry us to the
liquid-fueled
stars and
rocket
secure our
capability
place in
that had
history.
yet been achieved on American soil, a genuine and remarkable technical accomplishment. He stood in the desert and watched it go up, and felt, as he always felt at these moments, the
possibilities
particular
of tomorrow depend
complex
on the
mixture of
experiments of today.
satisfaction
Every
and
test
hunger
brings us
that
closer
was
to
the
unlocking
emotional
nature's
signature
secrets.
of his
This
relationship
apparatus
with his
will
own
change our
work.
understanding of the world.
Satisfied because the rocket performed as designed, because the engineering was right, because the years of calculation and construction and testing had produced a machine that did what it was supposed to do. Hungry because 9,000 feet was not enough, because the dream was still so much larger than the achievement, because there was so much further to go and the path was getting harder, not easier, and the support that he needed and that the work deserved was still not coming in the form or the scale that the moment required. The war was coming. Everyone could feel it by 1937, by 1938. Everyone could feel the shape of it gathering in Europe, the old darkness reassembling itself in new forms, the continent sliding toward another catastrophe with the particular horrible momentum of things that everyone can see happening and almost no one can stop. And Goddard, watching from his desert laboratory, understood something that the American military establishment was only beginning to grasp, that the coming war would be, among other things, a war of technology, a war in which the country with the most advanced propulsion systems, the most capable long-range delivery mechanisms, the most sophisticated guidance and control technology would have an advantage that might prove decisive, and that the country that had done the most foundational work in all of those areas was, indisputably, the United States, because of him, because of the work he had done, alone and underfunded and mocked and ignored in a frozen field in Massachusetts and a hot desert in New Mexico for 30 years. He tried again with the military. He presented his work to Navy officials in 1940, in the months before America entered the war, with more urgency and more detail than in any of his previous approaches. He was 60 years old, and his health was not what it had been, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has been living with his own mortality for long enough to stop flinching at it, that time was becoming a factor in ways that went beyond the abstract. He had things to contribute to the war effort, real things, concrete things, engineering knowledge and experimental data that could accelerate the development of jet-assisted takeoff systems for aircraft, of anti-aircraft missiles, of a dozen other military applications that were suddenly terrifyingly relevant. The Navy listened this time. They gave him a contract, not a large one, not the kind of large-scale program that the situation and his expertise arguably warranted, but a contract. He moved to Annapolis, Maryland to work on jet-assisted takeoff systems for Navy aircraft, JATO units as they came to be called, devices that used rocket thrust to help heavily loaded aircraft get airborne from short runways or aircraft carrier decks. It was important work. It was useful work, but it was also, in a very real sense, small work. Work that was far below the level of what Goddard could have contributed if someone had been willing to organize his knowledge and his experience into a serious, large-scale program. No one was willing to do that. The Navy wanted specific deliverables for specific applications. They did not want, or perhaps did not know how to want, the full depth of what Goddard had to offer. And so the man who invented modern rocketry spent the war years working on jet-assisted takeoff systems
systems in Annapolis, while the Germans, using knowledge built on his foundation, developed the V-2 ballistic missile, a machine that was, in its essential engineering principles, a direct descendant of everything Goddard had pioneered.
Behold the
V-2
rocket of
used
tomorrow.
liquid
Its
propellants.
sleek design and
It
powerful
used
engine will carry us to the
gyroscopic
stars.
guidance.
Observe
It
the
used
riveted panels,
thrust vector
crafted to endure the
control.
immense pressures of
It
launch.
used a turbo
This is just
pump
the
to
beginning of
feed
our journey.
propellants into the combustion chamber. Every one of these features had been developed and demonstrated first by Robert Goddard. When American military engineers eventually got their hands on
All
captured
systems go.
V-2
Launch in
hardware
3,
at the
2,
end of the
1,
war
gang!
and disassembled it to understand how it worked, one of them, a man who had been briefed on Goddard's work, reportedly said
Gentlemen,
that it
this
looked like
rocket
the
will carry
Germans
us to
had
the
been
edge of
reading
space.
Goddard's
Ignition
notebooks.
sequence start.
They hadn't.
Thrust is building.
They had arrived at the
We
same
have
solutions
liftoff.
independently because the physics dictated the solutions
This
and
missile
Goddard had
represents
kept
the
his
pinnacle of our
notebooks
engineering
locked
prowess.
away.
Its
But the
precision,
point
guidance,
stands.
and range are
The
unmatched.
V-2 was in its
Observe the
engineering
aerodynamic profile
DNA
and
a
propulsion
Goddard
shows our
rocket,
strategic
and it had been
superiority.
built by
This
someone
prototype
else
embodies the
with
future of
resources
aviation
that
propulsion.
dwarfed
Its
anything
guidance
Goddard
system
had
ensures
ever
a
had
precise
access to,
trajectory to
in
the
a
target.
program that
Come,
had moved from
the horizon
concept
awaits
to
our ascent.
operational weapon in less time
This is
than
the
it had
result of
taken
years of
Goddard to
research.
get his first
Its
rocket off the
design is
ground in
revolutionary
Auburn.
for its time.
He knew this.
It will change the
He
face
saw
of
the
modern
reports
warfare.
of the V-2
A new
attacks
era
on
of
London,
defense begins
and he
here.
understood immediately
This
from
rocket
the
embodies
technical
our commitment to
descriptions
pushing the
exactly
boundaries
what
of
the Germans
exploration.
had built
Its
and how
powerful
they had
engines
built
and
it.
advanced design
And
will
he
carry us
felt.
to new heights.
What did he feel?
The future of
We
space
do
is
not know
within our grasp.
precisely. He
This
was not a
rocket
man who
represents the future
expressed
of
his
our nation,
deepest
a symbol of
feelings in
innovation
ways
and
that
strength.
survived to the
With its
historical
powerful
record.
engines, it will
But we
carry
can
us to the
infer from
stars
the
and
few
secure our
accounts that
place in
exist of his demeanor in these final years that he felt something more complicated and more painful than simple professional disappointment. He felt the particular grief of a man who has given everything to a
possibilities of
vision.
tomorrow
There
depend
is
on
a
the
kind of
experiments of today.
ending that does not
Every test
feel
brings
like
us
an
closer to
ending,
unlocking
a
nature's
kind of
secrets.
closing that
This
refuses
apparatus
to
will change our
close.
understanding of the world.
The life of Robert Hutchings Goddard ended on August 10, 1945, in a hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, from throat cancer. A quiet, private death, largely unnoticed by a world that was, at that precise moment, consumed by the enormous noise of a war drawing to its close and the dawning, terrible comprehension of what 2 atomic bombs had just done to 2 Japanese cities. The newspapers that week had very little room for the death of an obscure physics professor from Worcester, Massachusetts. The obituaries that did appear were respectful but brief, written by journalists who understood in a general way that this man had done something significant with rockets, but who did not have the technical background or the historical perspective to articulate exactly what that something was or why it mattered as much as it did. The world buried Robert Goddard the way it had treated him for most of his life, with a combination of vague acknowledgement and profound incomprehension. And then it moved on. It would take the world a little while to understand what it had lost. It always does. But before we follow the legacy forward, we have to go back, one more time, briefly and carefully, to the man himself, to the human being inside the history. Because there is a danger in telling the story of a life as significant as Goddard's, of allowing the achievements to swallow the person, of reducing a complex, contradictory, deeply feeling human being to a set of firsts and patents and altitude records, to a symbol of American ingenuity or scientific persistence or the power of the individual vision. Robert Goddard was all of those things, but he was also something more particular and more vulnerable than any of those categories suggest. He was a man who loved his wife with a completeness and a dependence that he rarely expressed in words, but that was visible in everything he did. He was a man who was frightened, genuinely, deeply frightened, not of failure, which he had learned to metabolize, but of irrelevance, of doing all the work and having it mean nothing, of the dream dying with him, unfinished and unrecognized,
This rocket
in a world
embodies
that
the
had
dreams
never
of
fully
generation.
understood
We
what he
stand
was
at the
trying to
threshold
do.
of the stars.
Esther
Today, we take
understood.
the first step
She
into
had
the bus
always
halls.
understood.
A future
In the
is
final
ours.
years of his life,
This
when his
rocket
health
stands
was
as a testament
declining
to our
and the
nation's
work had been
resolve.
reduced
It is a
by the
shield against
war and by
depression
his
and a
body's
beacon on
increasing
technological light. We
unreliability
must press
to
forward
something
with unyielding
smaller than it had
determination.
once been,
This rocket
Esther
is the
was the person
culmination
who
of our
held the
tireless
full
work. It
architecture
will
of the
carry us
dream
beyond our
in her
earthly
memory.
bounds.
She knew
must
where
proceed with the
every
launch
notebook
without delay.
was. She had
is
photographed
now.
every significant test.
gather here at
She
the
had
threshold of a
managed the
new era.
correspondence,
This
the
structure
grant
symbolizes our
applications,
collective
the
strength and vision.
institutional
Let us press forward,
relationships,
united in
the
purpose,
1,000
to forge a brighter
administrative
tomorrow.
threads that kept the project
There she
connected
stands,
to the
a true
world of
marvel of
funding
engineering.
and recognition
Look at that, the
and
engines
official
are firing
acknowledgement.
up!
She had
Lift
done
off,
this for
what a sight!
20 years with a
Godspeed on
competence
your
and a
journey to the
dedication
stars.
that Goddard
This is a
depended
pivotal
on
moment in our
absolutely
history.
and acknowledged
vehicle
in his
behind me will
quiet
carry
way
us to the
constantly.
stars.
He was not a
Prepare
man
for
who made
launch.
speeches
Look at
about
it
his
go.
feelings,
A new
but he
era
was a
dawns.
man who, when he was
This rocket
away from
represents the
Esther for any
culmination of
length of
years of
time,
research.
wrote her
Its
letters that
successful
were,
launch will propel
beneath
us into
their
a new
surface
era of
practicality,
discovery. Ignition sequence
unmistakably
start.
love letters.
Lift off!
Letters from a man who
There she
needed her
stands, the
not just as a
culmination of our
partner
efforts.
or a
Engines
collaborator,
primed, all
but as the
systems a go.
person without whom the
Engine
whole
system.
enterprise of his life made less sense. In the summer of 1945,
Behold, the
when
pinnacle
it
of our
became
engineering
clear that the
prowess.
cancer
It will
was
soar
not
to the
going
heavens,
to be
exploring
beaten,
the unknown.
Goddard made a decision that tells you almost everything you need to know about his character.
Behold
He did
the
not
rocket of
spend
tomorrow.
his remaining
Its sleek
months in
design
the
and
kind of
powerful engine will carry us to the
reflective,
stars.
resting,
Observe the
making
riveted
peace
panels,
with the
crafted
world
to endure the
mode
immense
that
pressures of
people in
launch.
his
This is
situation
just the
are
beginning of our
often
journey.
encouraged to adopt. He kept working. He kept thinking about rockets. He kept filling notebooks, less prolifically because the energy was not what it had been, but filling them nonetheless.
All systems
He
go. Launch in
dictated
3,
technical
2, 1.
notes. He reviewed the work that had been done and made suggestions for what should come next. He was, right up to the end, a man
Gentlemen,
in the
this
middle
rocket
of
will
a
carry us
project,
to the edge of
rather than a
space.
man looking
Ignition
back on
sequence
one.
start. Thrust
He
is
was not
building.
interested in looking
We have
back.
liftoff,
Looking back
perfect.
was not, had never been where his attention
This
naturally
missile
went.
represents a pinnacle
His
of our
attention
engineering
went
prowess.
forward. It
Its
had
precision,
always
guidance, and
gone
range are
forward.
unmatched.
Even now, with the
Observe the
cancer in
aerodynamic
his
profile
throat
and
and the
propellant
war
shows our
outside
strategic
his window,
superiority.
and the
This
world
prototype
changing
embodies
so
the future of
fast that
aviation
even the
propulsion.
people
Its
driving
guidance
the
system
changes
ensures a
could
precise
barely keep up
trajectory
with
to the
them.
target.
His attention went
the
forward
horizon awaits
to
our
what
ascent.
was still possible, to what
This is
still
the result
needed
of
to be
years of
done,
research.
to the rockets
Its
that had
design
not
is
yet been
revolutionary
built,
for its
and
time.
the altitudes
It will
that had
change
not
the
yet
face
been
of modern
reached,
warfare.
and the
A new
distances
era
that
of
had not
defense
yet been
begins here.
traveled, and the
This
stars
rocket
that had
embodies our
not yet
commitment to
been
pushing the
touched.
boundaries of exploration.
He died on
Its
a
powerful
Tuesday
engines and
morning.
advanced design will
Esther
carry
was
us
with
to
him.
new heights.
The official
The future
cause
of
of death
space is
was
within our
throat
grasp.
cancer, but the
This
people
rocket
who knew him
represents the
best
future of our
understood
nation,
that
a
he had
symbol
been
of innovation
dying
and
of something
strength.
more
With its
complicated than a
powerful
physical
engines, it will carry
disease,
us to the stars
dying
and
of the
secure our
particular
place in history.
exhaustion of a man who has been carrying an enormous weight for an enormously long time, and who has never, not for a single day, been given the full measure of support that the weight
The possibilities
required.
of tomorrow
He
depend
did
on the
it
experiments
anyway.
of today.
He did it
Every
alone,
test brings
or
us
nearly
closer to
alone,
unlocking
for
nature's
nearly
secrets.
half a century,
This apparatus
and the
will
doing
change
of
our
it had
understanding
cost
of the
him
world.
in ways that the historical record can only partially capture. It had cost him his health repeatedly. It had cost him his privacy, his ease, the ordinary pleasures of a life not consumed by a single overriding purpose. It had cost him, at times, his peace of mind, those long nights of doubt and frustration, and the grinding internal reckoning of a man who believes completely in what he is doing and cannot, despite the belief, make it work. All of those costs were real. All of them were paid, and all of them were paid willingly, in the way that people pay the costs of things they have decided at the deepest level they cannot not do. He left behind at his death 214 patents. 214. The scope of what those patents covered is staggering when you look at it carefully. Not just the basic mechanisms of liquid-fueled rocketry, but gyroscopic guidance systems, multi-stage rocket designs, turbopump propellant feed systems, thrust vector control, regenerative cooling, variable thrust engines, the entire engineering vocabulary of modern rocketry laid out in patent filings that represent decades of original thought and original work, most of it done before anyone else in the world was working on the same problems. 214 patents, and a world that barely knew his name. He also left behind the notebooks, hundreds of them, filled with Esther's careful handwriting and his own hurried notations, documenting experiments and calculations and design iterations and test results, going back to the earliest days of his work at Clark University. Esther would spend years after his death organizing and preserving these records, ensuring that the full depth of what Goddard had done was documented in a form that the next generation of rocket scientists could access. It was an act of love and of historical conscientiousness that deserves its own recognition, the recognition of a woman who understood that the legacy she was protecting was not just her husband's legacy, but the world's, and gave years of her own life to making sure it survived. The world took its time catching up. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the dominant story in rocket science was not Goddard's story. It was the story of the V2 and of the German engineers who had built it, and of the frantic competition between the Americans and the Soviets to capture both the hardware and the human capital of the Nazi rocket program. Werner von Braun and his team surrendered to American forces and were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, a program whose moral complexity has never been fully resolved and probably never will be. These were men who built weapons that killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp, who had used slave labor from concentration camps in their manufacturing facilities, and who were now installed in American research laboratories and treated as valuable national assets because the rockets they knew how to build were considered more important in the cold calculation of post-war geopolitics than the moral accounting of how they had built them. Goddard, to the extent that he knew about von Braun and the German program in his final months, had complicated feelings about all of this that he did not fully articulate. He had seen the technical reports. He had understood what the Germans had built. He had recognized in the engineering of the V2 the solutions he had pioneered, solutions that had been developed independently by the Germans, but that traced their conceptual lineage to the same physical principles he had spent his life exploring. He did not claim credit publicly. It was not his way. But those who worked with him in his final months reported that he spoke of the German rocket program with a mixture of professional respect for the engineering and a deeper, harder-to-name sadness about the purposes it had been made to serve. He dreamed of stars. He had always dreamed of stars. And the first large-scale vindication of his life's work came in the form of a weapon pointed at cities. This is the wound at the center of Goddard's legacy that the celebratory accounts tend to pass over too quickly. The technology he pioneered was neutral, in the way that all technology is neutral, capable of being directed to any purpose that the people who control it choose to pursue. But Goddard was not neutral. He had a purpose, a specific and deeply personal purpose that had nothing to do with warfare and everything to do with exploration. He had wanted to send instruments and eventually, someday, human beings beyond the atmosphere of the Earth, beyond the gravity well, out into the vast and silent.
The recognition came eventually in the forms that official recognition takes. The Congressional Gold Medal, awarded posthumously, the naming of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, the largest of NASA's field centers, the one responsible for Earth science satellites and space physics, and the Hubble Space Telescope, named for a man who died thinking the world had forgotten him. The craters on the moon and on Mars that bear his name, the stamps, the statues, the school buildings, the streets, all of it arriving after the fact, as recognition almost always does for people who are too far ahead of their time for the world to keep up with them while they are alive. Esther lived to see most of it. She lived until 1982. Long enough to see human beings walk on the moon, long enough to see the rockets that carried them there, and to know, with a specificity that the general public could not share, exactly how much of what made those rockets work had originated in the notebooks she had spent 40 years preserving. She was asked, near the end of her life, what she thought Robert would have felt about Apollo, about the moon landings, about the fulfillment of the dream he had carried for so long. She said, after a long pause, that she thought he would have been glad. And then she said something else, something quieter and more complicated. She said that she thought he would already be thinking about what came next, about Mars, about the outer planets, about the dark spaces between the stars that no human instrument had yet reached. He would have been glad, she said, and then he would have gone back to work. That is the truest thing anyone ever said about Robert Goddard. He would have gone back to work.
Because the work was never finished. It was never going to be finished. The universe is too large, and human curiosity is too persistent, and the dream that Robert Goddard carried in his chest from the moment he climbed down from a cherry tree in Worcester, Massachusetts at 17 years old, that dream does not finish. It expands, it propagates, it passes from one generation to the next, carried in the equations and the engineering principles and the experimental data that one man produced, largely alone, largely unrecognized, with almost no resources and no support and almost no acknowledgement from a world that did not yet know what it was looking at. Think about what it means for a moment. Really think about it. Every spacecraft that has ever left this planet, every satellite that orbits above your head right now, providing the GPS signal that guides your phone, relaying the communications that connect you to people on the other side of the world, monitoring the climate and the weather and the health of the oceans and the movement of the continents.
This rocket
The
embodies the
Voyager
dreams of
probes,
generations.
launched in
We stand at the
1977,
threshold of the
now
stars.
traveling through
Today, we
interstellar
take the first
space,
step into the
the
puzzle.
first human-made
The future
objects
is
to
ours.
leave the solar system
This rocket
entirely,
stands as a testament
carrying
to
a
our nation's
golden
resolve.
record of human
It is a shield
sounds and
against
images
aggression
into
and
the
a beacon of
dark between
technological
the
light.
stars.
We must
The
press
Hubble
forward
Space
with unyielding
Telescope,
determination.
looking back
This
14
rocket is the
billion
culmination
years
of
to
our
the
tireless
edge of the
work.
observable
It will carry
universe.
us beyond
The
our
rovers
earthly
on
bounds.
Mars,
We
driving
must proceed
across
with
the
launch
red
without
desert,
delay.
sending back
The future is
photographs
now.
of a world that Robert Goddard
gather
looked
here at the
at through a
threshold of a new
small
era.
brass
This
telescope
structure
in Worcester,
symbolizes our collective
Massachusetts,
strength and vision.
and dreamed,
Let us press
with
forward,
the
united in
dreaming that
purpose,
was
to
also
forge a brighter
engineering, of reaching.
There
All
she
of
stands,
it,
a true marvel
every
of
bit of
engineering.
it traces its
Look at that, the
technical
engines are
lineage
firing
back to a
up!
liquid-fueled
Lift off,
rocket
what a
that
sight!
flew for 2.5
Godspeed on your
seconds
journey to the
to an
stars.
altitude of
This
41
is a pivotal
feet
moment
in
in
a
our
frozen
history.
field in
The vehicle behind
Massachusetts
me will
on
carry
March
us to the
16,
stars. Prepare
1926.
for launch.
Two
Look at it
and a
go.
half seconds,
A new era dawns.
41 feet.
This rocket
The
represents
distance
the
from the
culmination of
ground
years
to
of
the moon
research.
is
Its successful launch will propel us into a
238,000
new era of
miles.
discovery.
The distance from the
Ignition
ground
sequence
to where the
start.
Voyager
Lift
probes
off!
are now is more than
There she stands, the
14
culmination
billion
of our
miles.
efforts.
And it
Engines
all
primed, all
began
systems
with
are go.
2.5 seconds and 41 feet, and one man's absolute refusal to accept
Behold,
that
the
the
pinnacle of our
sky was the
engineering
limit.
prowess.
He was
It will
afraid
soar to the heavens,
sometimes.
exploring
It
the
would be
unknown.
dishonest not to say this. He was afraid of failure, not in the way of a man who cannot
Behold,
tolerate
the rocket
it,
of
but in
tomorrow.
the way of a
Its
man
sleek
who
design and powerful engine
understands
will carry us to the
exactly
stars.
what is at stake
Observe the
and
riveted
feels
panels,
the
crafted
weight
to
of
endure
that
the immense pressures of
understanding
launch.
every day.
This is just the beginning
He
of our
was
journey.
afraid of running out of time, of the body giving out before the work was done, of death arriving before the dream had been given enough of a foothold in the physical world to survive without him.
All systems
He was
go.
afraid
Launch
of
in
being
3, 2,
wrong
1.
in some fundamental way that he could not see, of having spent his life pursuing a vision that would turn out, in the end, to be
Gentlemen, this
flawed
rocket
in
will
some
carry us to
critical
the edge of
particular.
space.
He
Ignition
carried
sequence
these
start.
fears
Thrust is
alongside
building.
the dream,
We have
the way
liftoff,
all
left
human
ring.
beings carry their fears alongside the things they
This
love
missile
most.
represents a pinnacle
He
of our
did not let
engineering
the
prowess.
fears stop him,
Its precision
but
guidance
he
and
felt
range are
them.
unmatched.
He was human
Observe
enough to
the
feel
aerodynamic
them,
profile
and
of the
honest
Hubble
enough in
shows
the
our
privacy
strategic
of his own
superiority.
notebooks to
This
acknowledge
prototype
them.
embodies the future of
And there was
aviation
one
propulsion.
other fear,
Its guidance
a
system
quieter
ensures a
one,
precise
harder to
trajectory to the
name,
target.
but present in the record
The horizon
if you look
awaits
for
our
it.
ascent.
The fear of having mattered
This is
and
the
not
result of
being
years of
known to
research.
have mattered.
Its design
The
is
fear of
revolutionary
doing
for
the
its
work
time.
and
It will
losing the
change
credit.
the face of modern
The fear
warfare.
that is,
A
in
new
some
era of
ways, the
defense
most
begins here.
intimate fear of all.
This rocket
Not the
embodies
fear
our
of
commitment
failure,
to pushing the
but the
boundaries of
fear of
exploration.
invisibility,
Its powerful
of having
engines and
given
advanced design will
everything
carry
and
us to
being
new heights.
seen as
The
nothing.
future of space is
He
within our
felt
grasp.
this acutely
This
in the
rocket
years when
represents
the
the future
German
of our
program
nation,
was
a symbol of
advancing
innovation
and the
and strength.
American military
With
was
its
not
powerful
listening,
engines,
and
it
the
will carry us to
recognition
the
he
stars and
deserved was
secure our
not
place in
coming.
history.
He felt it in the way a person feels something they cannot afford to dwell on, briefly, intensely, and then set aside, because the work was more important than the feeling.
The
He was
possibilities
right
of
about
tomorrow
the work.
depend on the
He
experiments
was
of
always
today.
right about
Every
the
test
work.
brings us
And
closer to
history,
unlocking
in the
nature's
end, has
secrets.
been right about
This apparatus will
him,
change
though
our
it took
understanding
longer
of the
than it
world.
should have, and came in forms that he did not live to receive. He was not a saint. He was not without flaw. His secrecy cost the field he created real momentum. His difficulty with collaboration limited the scope of what he could achieve. His suspicion of others, however understandable in context, was sometimes excessive, sometimes counterproductive, sometimes simply the defensive reflex of a man who had been burned so many times that burning had become the thing he most feared. He was human, complicated and gifted and driven and afraid and deeply, irreplaceably human. And it is important to say that, to say it clearly and without apology, because the alternative is to turn him into a monument. And monuments do not teach us what human beings can teach us. Monuments are finished. Goddard was never finished. What he leaves us ultimately is not just a set of engineering innovations or a collection of patents or a list of firsts. What he leaves us is something harder to quantify and more important than any of those things. He leaves us a demonstration of what it looks like when a human being decides with complete and irreversible conviction that something which has never been done before is worth doing. And then does it. Not easily, not quickly, not with the support and recognition that the work deserved, but relentlessly, with the particular brand of patient, grinding, year after year relentlessness that in the end is the only thing that actually moves the world.
He leaves us the cherry tree. He leaves us the image of a 17-year-old boy in Worcester, Massachusetts, on a cold October afternoon in 1899, looking up through the branches at a pale autumn sky and feeling, for the first time, the full weight of a dream that would consume his entire life and outlast his death by centuries. He leaves us that moment, that ordinary, extraordinary, unrepeatable moment of a young person deciding what their life is going to be about, and he leaves us the evidence, written in the trajectories of every spacecraft that has ever left this planet,
the dreams of
that the
generations.
decision was right,
We stand at
that
the
the dream
threshold of the
was real,
stars.
that the
Today,
sky
we take
was
the first
never
step
the
into
limit.
cosmos. A
He
future
leaves
is
us,
ours.
finally, this.
This rocket stands
On
as a
July
testament to
20th,
our nation's
1969,
resolve. It is a shield
24
against
years
aggression
after
and a
Robert
beacon of
Goddard
technological
died in a
light.
hospital
We
in
must press
Baltimore,
forward with
largely
unyielding determination.
unnoticed by a world that
This
did not
rocket is
yet
the
know his
culmination
name,
of our tireless
two
work.
human
It will
beings
carry us
stepped out of a
beyond our earthly
spacecraft
bounds.
and stood on
We
the
must
surface
proceed with
of
the
the
launch
moon.
without delay.
They stood in
The
the
future
gray
is now.
dust of the lunar regolith
gather here
and
at the
looked up
threshold
at
of a
the
new
Earth
era.
hanging in the
This
black
structure
sky
symbolizes
above
our
them,
collective strength
and
and
the
vision.
Earth
Let
was
us
a
press
blue
forward,
and white
united in
marble,
purpose, to forge a brighter
heartbreakingly
tomorrow.
beautiful, heartbreakingly small,
There she stands, the true
suspended
marvel
in the
of
vast,
engineering.
dark,
Look at that, the
indifferent
engines are
silence of
firing
space.
up!
And the rocket that had carried them there, the
Godspeed
Saturn
on your
V,
journey to the
the most
stars.
powerful launch
This is a
vehicle
pivotal
ever
moment
built,
in our history.
the machine that made the
vehicle behind me will
impossible
carry
real,
us to the
was the
stars.
direct engineering
for
descendant
launch.
of a
Look at it
liquid-fueled
go.
rocket that
A
had
new era
flown for
dawns.
2.5 seconds
This rocket
in a
represents the
frozen field
culmination
in
of years of
Massachusetts,
research.
built
Its
by a
successful
man
launch
who had
will
been
propel us
told
into a new era of
repeatedly and
discovery.
confidently
Ignition
that it
sequence
couldn't
start.
be done.
Lift off!
The New York Times that
There she
same
stands,
day
the
printed a
culmination of
small
our efforts.
correction, a
Engines primed, all
retraction of
systems
the
a go.
1921
Engine
editorial that had
system.
mocked
Lift
Goddard's
off!
understanding of basic physics, that had suggested, with
Behold,
the
the
confident
pinnacle of our
ignorance of
engineering
people who
prowess.
had not done
We will
the
soar
work,
to the heavens,
that a rocket
exploring the
could not
unknown.
function in a vacuum. The retraction was 3 sentences long. It said simply
Behold
that it
the
now
rocket of
appeared
tomorrow.
the Times
Its
had
sleek
been
design
wrong,
and powerful engine
that
will carry us
Professor
to the
Goddard
stars.
had understood
Observe
the
the riveted
relationship
panels,
between
crafted to endure the
action
immense
and
pressures of
reaction,
launch.
and the
This is just
need
the
for
beginning of our
something
journey.
better than a vacuum against which to react, that the Times regretted the error. The error. 48 years of the wrong side of history reduced to 3 sentences.
All systems
It is
go.
hard to
Launch
know
in 3,
whether to
2,
find
1.
this funny
Igniting.
or heartbreaking. It is probably both. Robert Goddard never read that retraction. He had been dead for 24
Gentlemen,
years.
this rocket will carry
but
us to
Esther
the edge
read
of
it.
space.
She was
Ignition
76
sequence
years
start.
old,
Thrust is
and she read
building.
it in her home.
We have
And she
liftoff,
thought,
Jeffrey!
what did she think? She never said exactly,
This missile
but
represents
those
the
who
pinnacle
knew
of our
her
engineering
reported that she
prowess.
received the
Its
news
precision,
of the moon
guidance, and
landing
range
with
are
a
unmatched.
particular quality of
Observe the
stillness,
aerodynamic profile
not
and propulsion
celebration,
shows our
not
strategic
vindication,
superiority.
something
This prototype
quieter than
embodies the
either of
future of
those
aviation
things.
propulsion.
The
Its guidance
stillness of a
system
person
ensures
who
a
has been
precise
waiting a
trajectory
very
to the
long
target.
time for
Come,
the world to
the
arrive
horizon
at a
awaits
place
our ascent.
she always knew it was going,
This is
and
the
who
result of
feels in
years
the
of
arrival
research.
not triumph,
design is
but something
revolutionary
more
for
like
its time.
relief.
It will
Like the
change the
setting
face of
down of a
modern
weight
warfare.
that has been
A
carried
new
for
era of
so
defense
long
begins
it has
here.
become almost invisible.
This rocket embodies our
He would have
commitment to
gone
pushing
back
the
to
boundaries
work.
of exploration.
She said it, and
Its
it is
powerful
true,
engines and
and it is
advanced
the
design will
most
carry us
Robert
to new
Goddard
heights.
thing that could
The
possibly
future
be
of
said
space is
about
within
him.
our grasp.
He would have looked
This
at the
rocket
moon
represents
landing
the
and felt
future
the
of our
particular
nation, a symbol
deep
of innovation and
satisfaction of a
strength.
man whose life's
its
work has
powerful
been
engines, it will
vindicated
carry us
beyond
to the
any
stars and
possibility of
secure our
dispute,
place in history.
and he would have allowed himself that satisfaction for exactly as long as it took him to identify the next problem. And then he would have gone back to the laboratory and picked up the notebook and begun calculating the
Possibilities of
distance to
tomorrow depend on
Mars,
the experiments
because
of today.
that is who he
Every
was.
test brings us closer
Not a
to unlocking
monument,
nature's
not a
secrets.
symbol,
This
not a
apparatus will
cautionary
change our
tale about the
understanding of the
cruelty
world.
of the world towards its visionaries, though that cruelty was real and its costs were real, and they deserve to be named. He was a man with a dream and a pencil and an absolute refusal to stop. A man who looked at the largest possible version of human ambition and said with complete and quiet and unshakable conviction that it was not too large, that it was exactly the right size, that the only question worth asking was not whether it could be done, but how, and that the how was a matter of mathematics and materials and patience, and the particular kind of faith that is not religious but scientific, not mystical but empirical, not a belief in the supernatural, but a belief fierce and foundational, and finally vindicated in the capacity of the human mind to reach whatever it is determined enough to reach. The stars are still out there. They are out there right now, above you, past the clouds and the atmosphere and the thin blue shell of air that makes this planet habitable, burning in the cold, dark silence of a universe so large that the numbers required to describe its dimensions become almost meaningless. They were out there on October 19th, 1999, when a boy in Worcester climbed a cherry tree and felt the future. They were out there on March 16th, 1926, when a rocket flew for 2.5 seconds and changed everything. They were out there on August 10th, 1945, when Robert Goddard closed his eyes for the last time in a hospital in Baltimore. They were out there on July 20th, 1969, when human beings stood on the moon and looked back at the Earth and understood for the first time in the history of the species that the Earth was a place you could leave. And they are out there now, waiting, the way they have always waited, not with impatience, because the universe does not know impatience, but with the absolute, ancient, inexhaustible patience of things that have been burning for billions of years and will burn for billions more, regardless of whether anyone looks up. But someone will look up. Someone always does. Someone will look up from wherever they are standing, a backyard, a rooftop,
This
a
rocket
field
embodies the
somewhere,
dreams
a
of
city
generations.
street,
We
and
stand at
feel
the
what
threshold
Robert
of the
Goddard
stars.
felt. That
Today,
pull,
we take the
that
first step into the
recognition,
cosmos.
that sense of something
future is
enormous
ours.
and beautiful and
This rocket
absolutely
stands as a
real,
testament to our
reaching
nation's
down
resolve.
from the dark
It is a
and
shield
offering
against
itself
aggression
to
and a
anyone
beacon of
determined
technological
enough
light.
to reach back.
We must press
And
forward
when
with
they do,
unyielding determination.
when that person feels
This
that
rocket
pull
is the
and
culmination
decides,
of our
as
tireless
Goddard
work.
decided,
It
to
will carry
spend
us
their
beyond
life
our
answering
earthly
it,
bounds.
they will be
We must
standing
proceed with
without
the launch
knowing
without
it
delay.
on a foundation
The
that
future
one
is
man
now.
built, alone
We gather
in
here at the
frozen
threshold of a
fields
new
and
era.
desert heat,
This
with
structure
almost
symbolizes our
nothing but
collective
the
strength and
dream
vision.
and
Let
the
us press
mathematics
forward, united
and the
in purpose,
refusal
to
to
forge a
stop.
brighter tomorrow.
His name was Robert Hutchings
There she
Goddard,
stands, a true
and he
marvel of
pointed
engineering.
us at the stars.